Committee on Financial Services will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Today's hearing is titled Proxy Power and Proposal Abuse, Reforming Rule 14a-8 to Protect Shareholder Value. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning. Welcome to our committee today. As our securities laws were being considered during the Great Depression and the years after, corporate governance policymakers sought to ensure that stockholders had an active voice over any entrenched management, inattentive directors, or a controlling group. The intent was that all shareholders could assert their ownership rights around key components of running the business and capital allocation. Thus, while our proxy access process was originally designed to empower shareholders and provide them with a voice in company oversight, in recent years it's increasingly become co-opted by activist investors whose primary focus often lies not in maximizing shareholder value, but in pushing narrow political, social, or personal agendas. We've seen the shareholder proposal process diverted away from that critical business strategy focus and instead become a tool for advancing proposals to distract from companies' missions, leading to an erosion of shareholder value and additionally costly burdens on companies that are working to navigate today's complex business conditions and global competition. As we examine the shareholder proposal process, we also must consider the role of proxy advisory firms on capital markets as a whole. While these firms can offer valuable perspective, over the past 2 decades, their influence on corporate governance and voting on particular shareholder proposals has grown significantly. We must ask ourselves if these firms are still fulfilling the intended purpose of serving in the best interests of shareholders, or if they are distracting from the primary goal of enhancing long-term shareholder value. As we evaluate the current landscape surrounding Rule 14a-8 at the SEC, it's essential that we assess the impact of recent regulatory interpretations and guidance and how these have led us to where we are today. Particularly, we want to look at SEC staff legal bulletins 14L and 14M, which have had a significant impact on influencing how companies and shareholders engage with the proposal process. Staff Legal Bulletin 14L, issued in November of 2021 under then SEC Chairman Gensler, shifted the focus from shareholder proposal review from the proposal's relevance to a specific company to whether the proposed issue had broad societal impact. Expanding what counts as a relevant proposal makes it harder for companies to block items unrelated to their particular business, letting activists push measures that are disconnected and immaterial from the company's performance. As a result, we've seen an uptick in proposals that prioritize social or political issues over shareholder returns, which can divert attention from the fundamental goal of maximizing value for all investors. As we look at these recent developments, it's crucial to consider how we can reform the regulatory framework to restore balance and ensure that the proposal process serves its original intent. And I would argue that I hear from directors of public companies on all sides of the political perspective who share the view that this process has gotten away from that core tenets of the 1930s and 1940s of preserving long-term shareholder value. And with that, I yield back and I recognize my friend, the ranking member from California, the full committee, Mrs. Waters, for a 4-minute opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. For years, this committee has proudly championed the values of capitalism and the free market, but Donald Trump's actions with companies like NVIDIA, Intel, and U.S. Steel is not capitalism by any definition of the word. To be clear, I do think it is appropriate for the taxpayers and the citizens of this country to have upside when taxpayer investments generate profit for corporations and their shareholders. If we appropriately tax corporations, especially those that receive substantial government subsidies, we, the taxpayers, would benefit, but we won't. We don't. Yet, what Trump is doing is not growing the economy or protecting workers. His chaotic interference in private markets and the misuse of government tools is only to give Trump more ways to bully the American people. He's used the government to attack cities like Los Angeles and Washington, universities like Harvard, Columbia, and Brown, nonprofits like the National Endowment for the Arts, news organizations like NPR and PBS, former government officials, and law firms. Now, he's attacking corporations. And by the way, Trump promised that tariffs would bring American manufacturing back. But the latest job numbers show that the U.S. lost 42,000 manufacturing jobs since April, and businesses continue to pass off the cost of tariffs to consumers. This is the kind of sweeping authoritarian style communist takeover that China's leadership would applaud. And just like in China, Trump isn't doing this to help working class families. It's simply about control, consolidating power, punishing his enemies, rewarding political loyalty, and retaliating against those who refuse to bend to his will. As Trump tramples on American capitalism and our democracy, I'm absolutely appalled that as I look at Republicans who claim to be strong capitalists and tout the businesses they own. For example, Mr. Huizenga, are you ready to hand over 10% of your gravel business to Trump? Of course not. Instead of speaking out in defense of capitalism and democracy, Republicans are working with Trump's SEC to advance legislation that will further his anti-capitalist agenda by silencing the voice of shareholders. They want companies to ignore legitimate concerns from shareholders about climate change and other risks, simply because those concerns don't align with Trump's political agenda. And if you want a case study in why shareholder rights matter, look at Tesla. After Delaware's Chancery Court voided Mr. Musk's $56 billion award for a flawed process, the company reincorporated in Texas and is now proposing to award Mr. Musk with the obscene and outrageous pay package that will exceed $1 trillion. If Republicans get their way by silencing investors and remaking their boards to no longer be independent, public companies may experience a fate similar to that of Enron or WorldCom. And we all know what happened to them. As Trump operates as a communist and uses his government to control the economy, Democrats will fight to ensure that workers, not just the corporate elite, see and feel the benefits. We will also fight to ensure Congress, and not the president, determines how the government spends taxpayer resources on things that truly benefit taxpayers, like building housing, supporting health care, and caring for those in need. Anything less is unacceptable. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, Mr. Sherman, for a 1-minute opening statement.
Under capitalism, if by the sweat of your brow and the frugality of your spending you accumulate capital, if you have the courage to invest, you become a shareholder, and shareholders should be in control, not managers. Once again, the Democratic Party rises to the defense of capitalism against its greatest enemies, crony capitalism, and their handmaidens in Washington. The chair points out that corporate managers have said, these damn shareholders have gotten out of hand, and we've got to stop them. And that's what the bills in front of us are designed to do. This is not just theoretical. We know which side of capitalism the Chinese Communist Party is on. They are going to want to buy the technology behind artificial intelligence. They're going to want to control it. They're going to offer corporations huge amounts of money, and when those transactions close, the board gets huge bonuses. And they don't want shareholders to have a vote. And we will be told, shareholders, get out of the way. It's a big payday. That's shareholder value. No, that's selling out America to the communists. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Today, we welcome the testimony of Mr. James Copland, Senior Fellow and Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute, Mrs. Ferrell Keel, Partner at Jones Day, Mr. Ron Mueller, Partner at Gibson, Dunn, Crutcher, LLP, and Brad Lander, the Comptroller of the City of New York. We welcome all of you, and we thank you for being with us, taking your time to share your views with the committee. Without objection, each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation, and your written statement will be made part of the record. Mr. Copland, we're going to start with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this on? Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Waters, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is James R. Copland. Since 2003, I've been affiliated with the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, a nonprofit public policy think tank in New York City, where I have served as senior fellow and directed the Institute's legal policy research. Although my comments draw on work conducted for my employer, my statement today is solely my own. I am pleased that the committee is examining how the Securities and Exchange Commission oversees the submission and voting of shareholder proposals under Rule 14a-8. I have studied this process for more than 15 years, alongside related issues in securities regulation, including the role of proxy advisory firms and the voting practices of large index fund families. I address those topics at length in my written testimony. In this opening statement, I will focus on 3 brief points. First, U.S. capital markets continue to lead the world. Our markets efficiently allocate capital and have enabled firms founded within the last few decades to become global leaders. That dynamism helps explain why U.S. per capita growth has outpaced most other developed nations over the last 30 years. Second, public listings, however, have fallen by more than half since the mid-1990s. Many factors contribute, but a significant one is the increased cost and complexity of being a public company in the United States. That reality discourages listings and impedes capital formation. Third, part of the rising cost of public ownership has been spurred by congressional actions, including well-intentioned, but in some cases overreaching legislative responses to the collapse of the dot-com bubble and the 2008 financial crisis. Other costs of public ownership, however, have flowed from regulatory decisions by the SEC and other agencies without clear congressional mandate. Chief among these is the SEC's use of Rule 14a-8 to compel inclusion of shareholder proposals on corporate proxy ballots in ways that, in practice, override state corporate law. My conclusion, which I stated before this committee 2 years ago, remains. The SEC's shareholder proposal regime exceeds Congress's statutory mandate, displaces state corporate law without authorization, and impedes the efficiency and capital formation Congress has instructed the agency to prioritize. Congress should clarify that shareholder board interactions are matters of state law and remind the SEC that its role lies in facilitating disclosure, not dictating the substance of corporate governance. 2 developments have magnified the costs of the SEC's longstanding error. First, proxy advisory firms. 2 firms control virtually the entire proxy advice market. Each is foreign-owned. And these 2 firms have often favored environmental and social campaigns in shareholder engagement. Federal policy choices helped fuel the rise of this industry, and the shareholder proposal process has increased its leverage over U.S. companies. Second, passive index fund concentration in voting. Passive investing has been a boon to ordinary investors, including myself. But the three fund families that dominate this market now control a large and growing share of all shareholder voting. For various reasons, the big three index fund families, like the proxy advisors, have often supported shareholder proposals advancing social and environmental objectives not aligned with the interests of the average shareholder. In sum, two dominant foreign-owned proxy advisory firms and the big three passive index fund families hold extraordinary sway over the governance of all publicly traded corporations in the United States, and the committee is well advised to consider the SEC-dictated process over proxies in light of this reality. The 15 bills noticed for this hearing move in the right direction, though several warrant refinement, as I discuss in my written submission. I applaud the committee for tackling an issue vital to the American economy and to workers' retirement savings. I welcome your questions and look forward to working with members and staff on this important subject. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Keel, you're recognized for 5 minutes, and if we need to let Mr. Mueller share his mic, if your mic's not working.
Sorry.
You guys get cozy there. The box will move, Mr. Mueller. It's not glued to the desk there. You can move it a little bit. There you go.
Sorry, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Waters, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. My hope is to shed light on why Rule 14a-8 no longer effectively serves the interests of shareholders at large. My observations draw upon my experience counseling public companies, big and small, on securities, corporate governance, and ESG activism. But I am here today in my individual capacity and not on behalf of any client. I'll start by outlining a few of the challenges with Rule 14a-8 and then humbly offer a few ideas as to alternatives. Challenge number 1, shareholder democracy needs rational bounds. No right is limitless. For example, if I buy a seat on an airplane, do I have the right to use it as a soapbox and hold my fellow passengers captive for the duration of the flight? In the shareholder proposal world, any individual can buy a megaphone and a billboard on a company's proxy statement for $2,000. To put it in context, that represents 0.000002% of the market cap of the average S&P 500 company. Proponents are getting prime proxy real estate at bargain basement prices. It doesn't have to be this way. We see healthy shareholder engagement around the world despite much higher participation thresholds. Challenge number 2, Rule 14a-8 is too complex, making it subjective, inefficient, and easy to manipulate. The SEC has issued interpretive guidance on Rule 14a-8 through 18 staff legal bulletins over the last 2 decades. These bulletins change the goalposts with each new administration, and the guidance contains exceptions to exclusions and highly subjective frameworks that force companies and proponents alike to apply fuzzy standards like, does a proposal transcend ordinary business, or does it fall short? Is it significant or insignificant to social policy? Will it have a broad societal impact or just a limited one? Does it probe too deeply or just the right amount? The answers can only be known to the eye of the beholder. Complexity has a cost, and that cost is that Rule 14a-8 is unusable to the ordinary shareholder. How valuable is a right to speak if the average shareholder can't even figure out how to submit a proposal? The only people who have a shot are professional activists, individuals and organizations who are oftentimes not even shareholders. These professionals effectively borrow a shareholder's stake to get their foot in the door and then control the process from start to finish. It's not uncommon for the named shareholder to not engage with a company a single time. This means that the term shareholder proposal is a misnomer. In reality, most proposals are activist proposals. Challenge number 3, a proxy ballot is not an efficient place to hold a political referendum. Rule 14a-8 has turned companies' annual meetings into political hotbeds. For example, this proxy season, multiple companies had one shareholder ask them to promote DEI while another shareholder asked them to abolish it. More generally, proposals increasingly ask companies to opine on polarizing issues, as if companies can solve the toughest legislative and regulatory questions of our day. For example, proposals have asked a store that sells hammers and nails to make a statement on reproductive rights, a theme park to state its position on geopolitical issues in China, a credit card company to unilaterally formulate and execute gun sale regulation. I want to be clear, these are critically important issues, but what we're really talking about can be summarized in 3 questions. Is a company's annual meeting the right forum to address these issues? Are companies best situated to serve as de facto regulators, or are you? Do shareholders at large garner from the political proposals that have a tenuous connection to a company? Issue number 4, shareholder proposals are not costless. Companies pour an immense amount of energy into addressing proposals, and it can take a company hundreds of employee hours to coordinate engagement, strategy, and response. A company must consider whether it would cause them to jeopardize legal privilege, breach non-disclosure provisions, disclose proprietary or sensitive employee information, or reveal competitive strategies. Reducing the expense of a proposal to dollars and cents simply does not capture the intangible costs. What is the alternative? So with a system that's 3/4 of a century old, it's time to rethink the process. I think there are 3 essential options. Option 1, keep Rule 14a-8, but significantly revamp it. At a minimum, the ownership requirement would need to be raised, but it could also include other modifications like the SEC getting out of the business of adjudicating no action letters. The SEC and shareholders could rely on the independent boards to exercise their fiduciary duties and apply Rule 14a-8 in good faith. Truthfully, companies would struggle with this version of the shareholder process, given it is much easier to blame an umpire, here the SEC. Option number 2, eliminate 14a-8 and let states decide what is a proper subject matter, which is actually how 14a-8 was originally intended to operate. And then option 3 would be something more akin to what we would describe as private ordering. So you would keep 14a-8, but let companies and their shareholders decide how 14a-8 should be applied. I'm not sure I know which answer is best, but I do believe that living with the current system does not serve the interests of investors in the long run, and it'll ultimately hurt both companies and shareholders. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Mueller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Waters, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share my observations on why Exchange Act Rule 14a-8, the SEC shareholder proposal rule, should be revised and to address proxy advisory firms. My observations, which are my own and not on behalf of anyone else, are based on over 35 years as a securities and corporate governance lawyer, working with a wide range of U.S. public companies and addressing literally thousands of shareholder proposals. Rule 14a-8 is highly consequential, impacting many U.S. companies and all of those companies' shareholders, as well as the U.S. economy. Under the rule, a shareholder can require a company to include the shareholder's proposal and supporting statement in the company's proxy statement, thereby allowing all shareholders to vote for or against the proposal. As Chairman Hill acknowledged, when this rule was first adopted, the rule was designed to provide access to a company's proxy for a proposal that is otherwise proper under state law. However, the rule has taken on a life of its own with detailed eligibility and procedural provisions and 13 substantive bases for excluding a proposal from the company's proxy statement. If a company believes that a shareholder proposal does not satisfy the rule and wishes to exclude the proposal from the proxy statement, the burden is on the company to submit a no-action request to the SEC or to handle the matter in court. While I believe that shareholder proposals have and can be useful, the shareholder proposal landscape has changed dramatically over the past 10 or 15 years. First, the volume and the subject matter of shareholder proposals have changed significantly. During the 2017 proxy season, the number of social policy and environmental shareholder proposals exceeded the number of corporate governance proposals for the first time. And by the 2022 proxy season, the number of social policy proposals alone exceeded the number of corporate governance proposals. Second, the shareholder proposal process has changed. Rule 14a-8 has become subject to dramatic swings in how the rule is interpreted, resulting in uncertainty and increased cost to both companies and to shareholder proponents. In addition, proposals increasingly are crafted by special interest groups focused on narrow policy issues or specific outcomes. For example, a group that calls itself the Shareholder Rights Group includes some actual shareholders, but also includes investment advisors and consultants who handle most or all of the shareholder proposal process for their clients. They are, in essence, ESG guns for hire. The 16 members of this group account for more than 40% of all shareholder proposals. The role of the proxy advisory firms in these developments cannot be overstated. Shareholder proponents typically cater and structure their proposals to comply with proxy advisory firms' voting policies, meaning that the proposal is often a facade for the true objective of the proponent. As discussed in hearings before the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, the proxy advisory firm's objectivity is easily questioned. More proposals means more work for them. And of course, the proxy advisory firms have no economic stake in the consequences of their voting decisions, are not subject to any regulatory oversight, and do not have fiduciary duties to accompany shareholders. The shareholder proposal process imposes significant costs on companies, as Mrs. Keel said, particularly diverting key employees, executives, and directors from their normal work. As discussed in my written testimony, receipt of a shareholder proposal triggers numerous concurrent work streams that occur during an already busy time of the corporate year. Given all these consequences and costs, one has to question why a single shareholder owning shares with a value of $2,000 can initiate a process that imposes significant costs that are borne by all of the company's shareholders. In light of these dynamics, the case for reform of Rule 14a-8 and for regulatory oversight of the proxy advisory firms is compelling. Legislation limiting the abuse of 14a-8 can serve the interest of all shareholders and will help to maintain the business and focus and promote the continued success of U.S. companies. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Comptroller Lander, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral presentation.
Good morning, Chair Hill, Ranking Member Waters, New York members Velasquez, Meeks, and Torres, and other members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the importance of shareholder proposals and engagement. These tools help protect the retirement security of New York City's teachers, cops, firefighters, nurses. They're also an important foundation of the freedom to invest that has bolstered U.S. capital markets for decades. Yet the sponsors of today's proposals are seeking to gut these modest tools for accountability, allowing corporate CEOs to run roughshod over shareholders. As Comptroller of the City of New York, I serve as the investment advisor, custodian, and a trustee of our city's 5 pension funds, managing $300 billion on behalf of over 700,000 current and retired civil servants. My fiduciary duty is clear: to safeguard their retirement security for many decades to come. So we aren't day traders, we're long-term stewards, invested broadly across 10,000 public companies and markets worldwide. Strong corporate governance and risk oversight are foundational to healthy companies, healthy pension funds, healthy capital markets. As investors, we know that economic, governance, legal, operational, environmental, workforce, and reputational risks all affect company performance and shareholder value. Of course they do. It is our duty to weigh those risks. Shareholder proposals and engagement are among our most effective tools to do so. Over time, shareholder proposals have led to widely accepted practices that define modern corporate governance, strengthening our pension funds and broader capital markets. Consider executive compensation clawbacks. After the financial crisis, our systems filed shareholder proposals urging stronger policies. At Wells Fargo, our 2013 proposal led to a tougher clawback policy used to take back $60 million from executives after the fake account scandal. Or consider insider trading. In 2021, we brought shareholder proposals that highlighted concerns we had about 10b5-1 plans at Abbott Labs and McKesson. Those votes helped inform the SEC's 2022 amendments, protecting all shareholders from insider trading. Other reforms, such as stock option expensing and advisory votes on executive pay, began as shareholder proposals and were later codified. Another example is shareholder access to nominate independent directors, an effort we led through our Boardroom Accountability Project. Independent research has found that proxy access has led to improved performance at the companies where it was adopted and now broadly across the market. Most of our proposals, though, are resolved through engagement. In recent years, for example, we brought proposals at several U.S. banks for disclosing the ratio of their fossil fuel financing to clean energy financing. Simple disclosure, useful for all investors. J.P. Morgan Chase agreed and called it, and I quote, an excellent example of what ongoing engagements and pragmatic and reasonable requests can accomplish. At Starbucks, prompted by reports of management's interference with employees' rights to organize a union, we filed a shareholder proposal requesting a third-party assessment of Starbucks' adherence to its own commitments to workers' rights. The proposal received 52% of the votes of all shareholders, and Starbucks commissioned and disclosed the assessment. Other shareholder proposals have addressed investor risks, including excessive drug pricing and addictive opioids, railroad safety, online child safety at tech companies. The proposed legislative changes could block every one of those. They would erode the freedom to invest that has made American capital markets the envy of the world. They would lead to a world with more insider trading, fewer protections for investors, workers, consumers, and the environment, and more relatives of the CEO on corporate boards. Indeed, it's no coincidence these proposals come at the very same time that some corporations are seeking to evade accountability by reincorporating in states that have eroded shareholder rights. Tesla's proposed $1 trillion CEO pay package, enabled by cronyism on their board, is the most visible example. In other words, these proposals would harm our teachers, our cops, our firefighters, and our nurses on behalf of billionaire corporate CEOs, and more broadly, they would weaken the United States economy. As fiduciaries, our duty is clear: to protect the financial security of our beneficiaries, for which the health of our markets is essential. Shareholder proposals and engagement strengthen accountability and ensure that U.S. markets remain the most trusted and resilient in the world. Let's not screw that up. Thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective. I look forward to your questions.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now turn to member questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank have significantly impacted public corporations' annual proxy statements by increasing their regulatory requirements for disclosure, words and a discussion about executive compensation, and shareholder access. Together, these two laws have driven up costs, increased the length and complexity of proxy statements, and expanded the disclosure and oversight process, and fundamentally changed much of the shareholder access to the proxy system. Likewise, the now rescinded but 2003 safe harbor for investment managers using a proxy advisor to be off the hook for the responsibility of voting by delegating that authority to an advisor, that's been withdrawn, but it, on top of these other changes, added to exactly this costly process. And to the Comptroller's points, this isn't about reining in executive compensation, capital allocation, dividend policy, 10b-5 funds. That's all, I think, absolutely in the realm of what should be available for proxy access. It's where it goes beyond that to non-material business operations issues. And I put up my static display here in compliance with House rules to just show the change in the proxy process since I've been involved in corporate finance, now 40 years. I picked 4 public companies that have been consistently part of the S&P 500 since 1980, my first full year in the financial business: IBM, Procter & Gamble, 3M, and Merck. And the proxy in 1980 for IBM was 26 pages, Procter & Gamble 12. In 2020, IBM's proxy was 83 pages and Procter & Gamble's was 85 pages. Mr. Mueller, let me start with you. As you see these changes, and it outlines all the reasons why, both statutory and regulatory, would you say that the length of proxy statements has, what would you say the primary driver for that length in the proxy statements over the past 45 years? What's the top contributor, you think?
Sure, Chairman Hill. Certainly 3 things. Certainly the regulations that you mentioned, but I think there's 2 other factors going on. One is good and one is bad. I mean, the good news here is that companies now treat their proxy statement as a communication document, not just a compliance document. Shareholder democracy is alive and well in America, and the proxy statement helps fulfill that purpose. But the second cause is not so good, and again, it's the subject of this hearing, which are shareholder proposals and proxy advisory firms. Proxy advisory firms have certain criteria they look for when they're making their voting recommendations, and they will only look at an SEC filed document. And so preparing a proxy has now become an ISS and a Glass-Lewis check-the-box compliance process, adding to the length. There's also the shareholder proposal process itself. Whether or not a company receives a shareholder proposal, companies are acutely aware of what other proposals are being submitted to other companies. And so many companies try to avoid that target by proactively saying, look what we're doing on this issue, look what we're doing on that issue.
Thank you. I've always been concerned that sometimes more information is too much information and it's confusing. I don't know that it's in plain English. I really admire the issue of trying to expose clarity in management compensation, for example. I think we want comp committees that are, as Warren Buffett says, filled with saber-toothed tigers, not, pussycats. But on the other hand, I'm not sure the average investor could remotely figure out the pages and pages and pages of comp comparisons in a proxy. And so my advice to the commission would be to make that a lot simpler. Ms. Keel, thank you for representing Vanderbilt University today ably. Glad your mic is working. Talk to me about the economic relevance issue around Legal Bulletin 14M. Do you think that change will be better to allow companies to exclude proposals that really don't have an economic relevance to the to the corporation's business operations?
Sure, thank you. I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, but I don't think we can kind of overstate that it's going to be the kind of savior to the process. So before 14L, I counted just about 20 examples of when the economic relevance exclusion was actually relied upon. And I think it goes back to my written remarks about the kind of complexity of actually applying these standards. So if we look at this year's success rate with this economic relevance standard, which for background, it allows you to exclude a proposal if it relates to 5% or less of a company's operations.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your testimony. Thought it was quite well done. I yield back, and I recognize the ranking member of the full committee from California, Mrs. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lander, you're a fiduciary, which means you legally have to act in the best interests of the city of New York, responsible for the retirement security of over 750,000 public servants who work or have worked for the city. I want to get your take on a developing matter related to shareholder value and shareholder rights. As you may have read, President Trump has secured an over 10% equity stake in Intel, the great American chip maker. As part of this deal, President Trump has promised that the U.S. government's holdings in Intel will be passive. He has promised that the U.S. government will vote with Intel's board and according to Intel's management on all matters. As a fiduciary for 750,000 beneficiaries, if you were to own 10% of any large company, especially one that apparently has management and governance issues that have caused it to lose out to its competitors, would you forego your opportunity to exercise voting rights?
Thank you, Ranking Member Waters. Of course, we would not forego our responsibility, not just our rights, to exercise our voting power if we were 10% of shareholders. And I think what you said at the beginning about the hypocrisy being exposed here, I mean, what could be more a form of crony capitalism than the president deciding, without any clear rules, without any role for Congress, without any guidelines, when the U.S. government is going to take a position in companies, and then say, as you've just said, that management can do whatever they want. There's 90% of the other shareholders in Intel are people like our funds, our small investors, who now have been told the U.S. government is going to take a very large position and just let the management do whatever they want. It will erode independent shareholder governance and accountability that are a foundation of our capital markets, make it hard for funds like ours to invest in with trust and confidence. And it really risks, both the retirement security of small investors and beneficiaries like ours and the broader independence of our capital markets and their accountability to shareholders.
Continuing on, President Trump is supposed to be acting in the best interest of the American people. Is it prudent and financially responsible to blindly go along with Intel's management on, for example, executive compensation or providing corporate perks like apartments, private jets, or year-end bonuses? As you know, these are the kinds of decisions that Intel's board and management are responsible for. What would stop them from rewarding their failures if Intel's largest shareholder is voiceless and voteless?
The whole concept of shareholder governance is that on the board, there will be some independent shareholders, independent members who represent independent shareholders in relationship to management. Some interests, of course, are aligned, but not all interests are aligned. So what is appropriate for CEO compensation? How the board itself should be structured, how compensation will be deferred. There are a whole set of areas where you've got to have independent members of the board exercising that responsibility to provide oversight. And if what happens increasingly in American companies is that the president decides to take a large position and then give carte blanche authority to its managers, again, that is what we mean by crony capitalism. On some of these boards, you have the relatives or buddies or former business partners of the CEOs, and what you need is independent members who are looking out for the interests of the much broader, smaller, and more diverse set of shareholders, and the steps the president has taken at Intel jeopardize that independence.
Thank you very much. What I don't get is this. Why is it management with the so-called independence board would think shareholders are not interested in having the best results if they are, responsible for the fiduciary concerns of the board? Why do they believe that somehow they're not in the best interest of earning profits for everybody? You get it?
Yes, look, this is an important debate. There's a room for conversation between management and board members, but shareholders want good returns at the companies that we invest in. All the proposals that we bring are designed to achieve that.
Gentleman's time has
Thank you very
expired.
much.
The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Heisinger, who is also the vice chair of the full committee and former chairman of the ESG task force, is now recognized.
Hey, thank you. I was going to say Chairman Hill, but Chairman Barr. I know Chairman Hill's got a markup. Mr. Chairman, I do have to at least address one thing. My family business, third generation sand and gravel operation, was brought up, and I guess I would just note that I'm glad I'm not a publicly traded company and not subject to a bunch of ESG woke activists from California coming in and trying to tell me how to dig dirt. But not every company has that same fortunate position. But I do want to thank the committee and Chairman Hill for continuing to highlight the abuses that happened under the leadership of former SEC Chair Gary Gensler, who allowed and frankly encouraged activist investors to hijack the shareholder process and push a social agenda that ultimately harmed publicly traded companies and their investors. By some estimates, under the Biden-run SEC, these environmental, social, and political proposals grew by almost 60%. I'm proud of the work of the ESG working group, as you had just noted, and what we had done, and many of the issues that, exact issues that we've talked about already today were explored by that committee. Lastly, I think it's crucial that the committee continue to explore and hold the proxy advisor firms accountable. The outsized influence of Glass Lewis and ISS have harmed the shareholder process. These proxy advisory firms bear none of the consequences their recommendations have, and have even fought against exact proposals when it applied to them that they encouraged to be applied to other publicly traded companies. They operate without sufficient transparency and have become the de facto standard settlers for corporate governance policies in the U.S. And as chairman, I was happy to see them testify before our oversight committee last Congress. And I think we should continue to hold them accountable, encourage them to be more transparent, especially as they navigate conflicts of interest in the firms that they supposedly serve. Mr. Copland, I want to start with you. A lot has happened since the first time you came in front of our committee in 2016. The issue of proxy voting and shareholder proposals has become somewhat of a political football, to say the least, as shifts in policy have flipped back and forth. How has the volume and nature of the shareholder proposals changed over the past decade? And are you seeing more proposals focused on specific social or political issues? And have we been able, through our work here in Congress, have we been able to maybe curb some of that and influence the impact of those?
Well, the short answer is the volume's increased significantly up until this year, and we've seen a decrease this year. I do think that the
Regime change, I think it happened.
I think the regime
SEC.
change and from the SEC going from 14L to 14M has made a difference. But in terms of how these have been received, I mean, certainly as Mr. Mueller sort of talked about in his opening statement, we've seen up until recently, a substantial uptick in the number of social and environmental proposals. When I started tracking this 15 years ago, there were still a fair number of them, but they were a much smaller percentage. The other
It's
thing
really
is,
exploded.
yeah, and when I first testified, it's not the first time I testified in front of this committee, but on this subject matter specifically in 2016, I could say no shareholder proposals ever gotten majority shareholder votes over board opposition at the Fortune 250. That switched shortly after that in 2017, and you started seeing more of these, and that reflects the change in voting pattern from the voting advice from the proxy advisory firms and voting pattern from the big three. So
Passive index investors have been brought up or at least alluded to, and they seem to have scaled back some of the support for ESG proposals. However, the proxy advisory firms can swing approximately a third sometimes of those types of votes. As a committee, we've discussed bills such as the Index Act and My Empowering Shareholders Act as a solution, which would, I think, de-emphasize their influence. Should large brokerage firms continue to move towards empowering individual investors?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I don't think the uptick is going to be huge from it, so I do like something like the mirror voting that the Index Act that Senator Sullivan originally introduced does on that. I explained it more in my written testimony and in the paper I wrote last year that I...
We'll follow up. And Mrs. Keel, I want to, last moment, I'm going to have to follow up in writing. I wanted to know, resource-wise, the impact that these proxy advisory firms have on the SEC. And we'll submit a question. I want to talk about Toyota in particular.
Gentleman's
So with
time
that,
has
I yield back.
expired. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, is now recognized.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Comptroller Lander, it's always great to see you, especially here in Washington. While the other side continues to rail that corporate disclosures and shareholder input on subjects like corporate diversity, executive pay, climate, and political donations are woke ideas that have no connection to a company's bottom line, they fail to recognize these subjects are about investment and market risk. As head of the New York City Pension Fund, one of the largest in the country, don't you want all relevant data and information about an investment?
Absolutely. There is simply no simple line for an investor in thinking about what the risks are at a particular company. You worry about reputational issues. You worry about leadership and will it change. You worry about, is the broader regulatory structure in the industry going to shift? There's no neat line. That's what it means to be an investor. All investors are trying to get all the information we can, assess that range of risks. And yes, of course, some of them are shifts in the economy or the economic sector, but they're legal, they're operational, they're environmental, they're workforce. What these proposals do is bring more information and transparency so we can evaluate those risks effectively.
In fact, isn't it your duty as a fiduciary to our city's pensioners to consider all material data, risks, and opportunities relevant to a portfolio?
Absolutely, and I'm lucky to have a great team of people to help assess those risks who say, here's what we need to know from a company. And sometimes they'll tell us directly and we can do it through engagement. Often we file a proposal and then the company works with us, as I mentioned for JP Morgan Chase. Sometimes we bring a resolution and that helps provide that transparency.
And as a fiduciary, isn't it true that your main responsibility is to secure the strongest risk-adjusted return for your beneficiaries?
My fiduciary duty is to secure the strongest risk-adjusted returns for my beneficiaries, who again are teachers and nurses and school crossing guards. Risk-adjusted is what's key there. What an investor is doing all the time is assessing risks. How can you do that without the full panoply of information?
Thank you for that answer. Comptroller Lander, you lead our city's pension fund. The New York City Pension Fund has filed resolutions for decades on issues associated with climate change, diversity, human rights, and political spending. As head of our city's pension fund, what is your philosophy that leads you and the pension fund to use the resolution approach? And do you believe it is consistent with your fiduciary's duty as Chief Financial Officer?
So we always start from fiduciary duty to achieve maximum risk-adjusted returns for our beneficiaries. And again, when you wake up every day responsible for the retirement of the hardworking people who make our city run, it's easy to keep that in mind. I gave some examples in my testimony. If we think a company's got insider trading risks, that's the thing we're going to look at. With corporate board diversity, it has been proven through independent research that Bloomberg and others have done that having a more diverse board helps you see the broad issues facing your economic sector better and improves financial returns. The same is true for proxy access to nominate directors. That's what we evaluate. All of the effort to bring shareholder proposals to evaluate risks are done to improve that risk-adjusted return.
And have you found companies to be responsive to these engagements?
Most of our proposals are resolved through engagement. I gave the example of JP Morgan Chase, no small company, who last year agreed after we filed a resolution with them seeking disclosure of their ratio of their fossil fuel financing to clean energy financing. They engaged with us and they agreed to start providing that disclosure. We then withdrew the proposal. It didn't have to go to the ballot. All investors have that information.
So based on your experience so far, why do you think my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and their allies in the MAGA movement are focused on limiting shareholder input?
I really don't understand it. Once upon a time, Republicans were defenders of free markets, and this is an effort to erode them and give more power to corporate CEOs at the cost of small shareholders.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, also chair of the Monetary Policy Task Force, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Beginning with you, Ms. Keel, there's broad consensus here that reforms need to take place in regard to shareholder proposal process. How can we make the necessary changes while protecting the legitimate rights of shareholders to engage in good governance?
Sorry, can you say the last part?
How can we make the necessary changes while protecting legitimate rights of shareholders to engage in good governance?
Sure. So I think what we're really here to talk about is not limiting any sort of shareholder right. We're trying to add boundaries to make it an orderly process, to make it focused on things that are important to companies, not things that are just political referendums to decide whether or not a social policy is good or bad or its merit. What we really need to do is to focus it on a proposal that's worthy of the investors' attention, and that is something that is going to bring value to the shareholders.
Let's focus on the relevance exclusion in Rule 14a-8 I-5. I've heard from industry stakeholders that the rule's broad language has rendered the exclusion almost meaningless. Mr. Copland, Would a materiality standard be more workable? Would it be helpful in limiting shareholder proposals to those that are truly relevant to a company's business?
Yes, and I've argued in my testimony and previously that it would be very helpful to codify materiality as a requirement for the SEC. I think Representative Huizenga's got a bill here on that point, and it's very important because we had a SEC commissioner in the last administration, Allison Heron-Lee, who was arguing our disclosure rules didn't have to be material at all, and that's where we got the climate disclosure rulemaking.
I've been very focused in my time on this committee on strengthening capital formation through our public markets, and the previous administration's SEC promulgated rules that discouraged companies from going and remaining public due to high compliance costs. Mr. Mueller, how can we increase the attractiveness of our public markets through corporate governance regulatory framework?
Well, thank you. It's important to re-examine the rules and make sure they are still working. And the good news here, I think, is that SEC Chair Paul Atkins is one of the first chairs in a long time that is looking at old rules and saying, do they justify the cost and benefits? It would also be incredibly helpful to have a public company advisory committee at the SEC, and there's legislation supporting that.
And let me simply say in closing, I would note that my bill, the Public Company Advisory Committee Act, would give public companies a formal avenue from which to advise the SEC on the practical effects of their rules, regulations, and policies. This idea has bipartisan support and would help prevent the regulatory whiplash that we've seen through the SEC between administrations. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who is also the ranking member of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, is now recognized.
Thank God we've had shareholder proposals. They've helped us create the norm of having independent directors, of having annual elections for directors. The average Russell 300 company gets a shareholder proposal about once every 8 years. So we're not overwhelmed by all this. Mr. Copland and Ms. Mueller say that we should leave these issues to a matter of state corporate law. What an outrageous attack on shareholder power. Because you've got 50 states. And so if Delaware says no to a $1 trillion compensation package, you just go to Texas. But wait a minute, Texas might limit you to $1 trillion. Go to Wyoming, they'll do $2 trillion. And you know where you can go if you need $3 trillion? You just incorporate in the Cayman Islands. And look, Wyoming is desperate for money for their state operations. It's not the job of their legislators to police the national capital markets. And if they see 10 or 20 or $30 million of revenue for their state, why shouldn't they accept that in order to make sure that Elon Musk gets $2 trillion instead of the $1 trillion that cheap people in Texas might limit him to? We're told that there are only 2 firms that are providing this advice, so we should have more, and we do. Vivek Ramaswamy is creating one. Egan Jones is creating one. I like Mr. Copland for pointing out that these are not frivolous proposals that just get voted down. The reason we're here is because these things pass, and the crony capitalists don't want to be disturbed in their power. This isn't about companies that won't publish a 93-page document that used to be a 28-page document. Ms. Mueller and others have said, well, the company shouldn't decide, or the shareholder shouldn't decide DEI policy, they shouldn't decide ESG policy. Who in the hell should decide that? The crony capitalists? Mr. Lauder, thank you for pointing out that shareholder proposals have focused on opioids. If only there had been a shareholder proposal that passed at Purdue Pharma, that would have been shareholder value and would have saved thousands, tens of thousands of lives. Under communism, the party decides who controls the means of production, and we are told now by the chair of the SEC that it is simply illegitimate for the shareholders to have a role in ESG. We're told by others that you have to be an Ebenezer Scrooge investor. You cannot be a John Denver investor. In which country are the capitalists told you have to emphasize profit over the survival of the planet? Shouldn't the shareholders decide that? Materiality is what the shareholders want, not just what's earnings per share. But Mr. Lauder, if there was a proposal at a company considering selling the most valuable AI technology, the keys to the 22nd century, the keys to dominance in the world, and the company was going to make a lot of money, and big bonuses for management, do you think that would be good shareholder value that you would vote for?
This is such a good example. We are going to need good AI policy in the coming years. And of course, Congress will have a role in developing and setting it, but the corporations that are operating that technology are clearly going to have a role as well. And of course, shareholders need an ability to weigh in on those issues and not just leave it to managers who indeed have much more short-term and personal interests. So that is a great example of something that needs to be figured out in this way.
When the corporation can hire whatever law firm it wants without criticism, they can devise policy without sharing it in advance with the other side. Should shareholders be subject, if there's a battle between management and shareholders, should it be a fair fight, or should we have rules as to who you can hire if you're a shareholder, but no rules for who you can hire as a consultant if you're the
One thing I think that's important to point out is the SEC already rules for management 68% of the time when shareholders bring proposals and managers object to them. So it is
And we
not a
should be
willy-nilly-
changing the rules to allow more shareholder democracy. I think Ms. Mueller pointed out how complicated these rules are. We should make them simple and allow shareholder power. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, is now recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to welcome the panel that we have today. I think each of you have come to Washington. You knew what existed before you came up here, and that is the difference of the sides, not only politically, but also our viewpoint of the marketplace. So I learned a long time ago that politically driven policy certainly has objectives, and it also has outcomes. And the outcomes that I think that I follow, as my dear friend Frank Lucas said, is shareholder value when we're dealing with these companies. So, Mr. Copland, during the Biden years, over 80 environmental and social shareholder proposals were approved. Yet in the past year for these proposals, many of these proposals collapsed with no environmental proposals passing and only 4 social proposals succeeding. Generally speaking, I have heard you and the panel say that they think that the big 3 passive assets managers had a direction to this outcome. Could you discuss that again for me, please?
Yes, all 3 of the passive index fund families, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, reduced their support for the environmental and social proposals relative to recent norms. I mean, they previously were not as much behind them, and there's sort of this bubble up, and then this year they've pulled back. The proxy advisory firms also have been less likely to recommend for some of these proposals. I do think, obviously, the change in leadership in Washington has had a lot to do with that, as well as public.
So it's policy that is political, not so much economic?
Well, there are economic imperatives, right? I mean, when BlackRock is facing investigation from state attorneys general, when they're seeing advertising campaigns about it, it could hurt their market share, et cetera. I think they've realized some of this, but I do think a lot of it is, there's a different sort of an enforcement environment. There's a different rulemaking environment, and so there's
Sometimes it's a result of actually how the performance in the marketplace worked. I don't want to just say Tesla, there could be a lot of other things, but some of these, the selling of these proposals based on politics, the outcome did not exactly work the way we thought it would, did it?
No, I mean, it's a strange example to fixate, as some of the members have, on executive pay at a company that's in the last 25 years become one of the 10 biggest companies in the world. It's a strange fiduciary obligation that the Comptroller is asserting here, and that's part of the problem, right? I mean, we need shareholder oversight, but we need shareholder oversight for people who have skin in the game, that are long-term thinkers, and that are taking significant stakes in companies, like real activist investors. He's saying we're not we're long-term buy and hold in the entire market. The passive index funds are the same way. Why are they well-positioned to be dictating this stuff? He's an elected politician.
Yeah, Ms. Keel, if you could address for a second the impact. We receive feedback as members of Congress from companies, many times CEOs, many times board members. Could you tell me what you think they have a feeling about having these, in essence, three big companies, three big asset manager groups to drive the people and their agenda?
Sure. I mean, every company is going to have to take into account the different constituents, and so there's a lot of engagement. I think there's kind of a misunderstanding sometimes that companies are not engaging with their shareholders. They are. They're doing it during the season, off season. They are always talking and receiving that feedback. So I think that companies welcome shareholder feedback. I think that just needs to be clear.
Yes, ma'am, but I'm talking about specifically that's driven by these asset managers that are attempting to drive what might be political ideas as opposed to necessarily economic as it relates to that company.
No, so I've been focused mostly on the proxy advisors. I think companies probably feel the sting from the proxy advisors a bit more directly and acutely than the big three, but you're certainly right that each of the big three has their own policies and they apply those, and as a company is evaluating what it's going to do or position it's going to take, it has to look at all of its big stakeholders, each one of their policies, each policy of the proxy advisor, and it's going to have to kind of take into consideration each of those in addition to the SEC requirements and other regulatory environments that they're subject to.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think that this panel, as we've gone across both sides, is answering a lot of important questions, and I thank them, and I thank the chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Thank you. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Comptroller Lander, to Washington, D.C. I'm sitting here listening to the questions, and I've been thinking, why are we here today? I think we're here today because Republicans think it is bad that shareholders of companies get to decide how their companies that they own operate. They're upset because that some shareholders of some companies choose to emphasize things like the environment, like diversity and LGBTQ rights. And as different studies have been done on the companies that undertake environmental, social, and governance initiatives. And I've had the opportunity to talk to some of the CEOs and others. And but they've told me, I said, why do you do these things? Often what they say to me is because it's good for business. It's good for their bottom line. That's why they do it. Here we are, and we continue to focus on everything else rather than confronting the President of the United States' gross mishandling of the economy. And I got to tell you, I never expected to see the day where a Republican president is taking 10% stake in an American manufacturer on dubious legal authority. But what surprises me more is that my Republican colleagues in Congress who say that they're for free market is entirely silent on this issue, if not supportive. And that's not to mention Donald Trump's trade war against the world. The economy is slowing, prices are increasing, and the unemployment rate is rising. Countries around the world are no longer sending us packages, and postal shipments are now down 80%. My Republican colleagues could do something about this if they demanded a vote on repealing the tariffs. Or what they could do? They could sign my discharge petition to get a vote on these tariffs that raises the taxes on American families. And that is the context for today's hearing. The president wants to bring parolism to the Potomac, and Republicans in Congress want to look the other way while arguing owners of a company should say less in how their company is ran. Comptroller Lander, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I believe, when this is what they're trying to do, they're trying to turn ESG into a boogeyman. But I want to ask you to clarify for the American people how this actually works. If a shareholder proposal gets a vote, does it only need 10% support to govern the company? Yes or no?
No, Congressman, it needs a majority.
More than 25%?
Well, I'm sorry, more than 10%, more than 25%.
More than 40%?
More than 40%.
Oh, I'm shocked. So it needs at least, what? A majority is what you say?
50% plus one.
Okay, so a majority is needed to approve a proposal. What are the demographics of the shareholder base? Are they young, left-wing activists, the main holder of capital in this country?
They are not.
They're not. Okay. Now, so the shareholders are disproportionately the founders and senior managers of a company, risk-adverse institutional investors, and working Americans interested in saving for retirement rather than culture wars. Would you say that better describes who these individuals are?
Yes, it does.
Great. Now, in the little time I have, I chair the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'm concerned that they're making moves, Republicans are making moves now that would restrict investor shareholder rights and backfire on us because Europe is actively making itself more attractive to global investors, integrating its financial markets, and rolling out new reforms to deepen market access. For example, the European Commission even rebranded its capital markets union as a new savings and investment union to channel more private investment into EU markets. So my question is, if we hamstring investors here in the United States by undermining their rights, won't pension funds like New York City's now just look other places and go overseas to put their money?
If we allow this to be adjudicated in 50 different state courts, we will see much less investment in U.S. capital markets.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and it's good to hear my friend from New York extol the virtues of business and capitalism. Maybe he could impart that wisdom on his friend, Mr. Mamdani. Maybe he could learn from you, Mr. Meeks. So let's be clear. Allowing a small group of left-wing activists to hijack the proxy proposal process to push social, environmental, DEI, or political objectives totally unrelated to the core business of a company does not advance the cause of capitalism. It undermines capitalism. It corrupts capitalism because it results in the misallocation of resources of the company. It undermines the profitability of the company. It hurts the shareholders. It doesn't advance the value of the shares of the stock. It hurts the value of the shares of the stock. That's what we're talking about here today. And let's go to Mrs. Keel, because you've seen this in your practice. What is the cost in terms of time, resources, legal fees of responding, engaging with these petty political shareholder proposals?
Sure. So I'm happy to kind of tick through what especially the intangible costs are, which is, deciding whether something has first been substantially implemented. So a lot of times these proposals will have been already considered by a board and implemented. That's a cost to determine that in and of itself. You'll have to decide whether it's a compliance with law type proposal. So for example, this season we saw a lot of illegal deforestation and avocado supply chain proposals. Next, you're going to have to ask, is this something...
Avocado supply chain. I mean, this stuff is so absurd. Does any of this advance the profitability of the enterprise?
I have not seen the financial analysis.
So it's not about what's good for business. It's actually trying to hijack and undermine the business. It is an attempt to politicize the business, totally unrelated to the mission and core mission of the business. Mr. Mueller, how has the SEC's interpretation of significant policy issues evolved over time, and has this evolution contributed to the use of shareholder proposal process for non-pecuniary ends?
It certainly has during the Gensler administration. The slab 14L that we talked about just totally divorced relevance to the company from the shareholder proposal process. And it's important to focus that many of these proposals that are being cited as good examples were all corporate governance proposals. But if ESG matters are good for the companies, then the executives are pursuing that. They don't need the cost and expense of a shareholder proposal to tell them how to run the company best.
And explain how the determination of what is a significant social policy issue has changed over the years and why the shifting SEC interpretations are harmful.
The shifting interpretations are harmful because they really introduce costs to both sides. It makes it hard for shareholders to know what is a proper proposal to submit, and it makes it hard for companies to say, do we have to fight this at the SEC, or should we put it in the proxy statement?
Ms. Keel, why isn't the SEC Rule 14a-8 I-5, which is supposed to exclude irrelevant proposals, and all these proposals are totally irrelevant to the management of the company, why is that not more frequently used as a basis for excluding shareholder proposals?
Sure. So first you have to do a calculation of the 5% test. That's a fairly straightforward, although it's also kind of unclear how to apply that. But then there's an exception that says unless it's significantly relevant or important to a company. And so if you give some examples from this season, we saw 4 that were successful. They related to human rights in India, sugar supply chain, puberty blockers, and the sale of the abortion pill. Those are examples of what was successful in getting them excluded. And then the ones that were unsuccessful were reports on religious discrimination, indigenous people's rights, and human rights in Russia and Ukraine. So you see that it's kind of hard to draw a line.
And the example that you give about a business that's in the business of selling hammers and nails, and they have a proposal on reproductive rights. I mean, this stuff is out of control. And we need to get rid of the politicization of business. This is not about capitalism. Let's be clear. This is about hijacking capitalism. It's about politicizing businesses. And we got to get rid of this rotten stuff, and we got to get back to actual capitalism so that shareholders can actually get a return on their investment and stop and get politics out of this so that shareholders don't lose the returns that they deserve. And with that, I will yield and recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you very much, Chairman. You know, the stock market is the heart and soul of our financial system. And I went to elementary school in Scarsdale, New York, at Fox Meadow Elementary School. And our class project in the 6th grade was to go out, earn our own money, do our own research, and purchase stock, and then take the Scarsdale bus down to the New York Stock Exchange and buy stock. And I've been buying it ever since. And I can tell you this, proxy advisors provide critical, independent research and recommendations that allow shareholders to hold boards of directors accountable and to access responses to corporate governance and make the investor have some sense of protection. That's all we're talking about here. So, Mr. Landers, without proxy advisors, firms, what challenges do shareholders face in analyzing thousands of proposals and director slates during the proxy season?
Small shareholders simply would not be able to have information to assess the risks they're facing and vote their interests without the kind of information that the proxy advisors give. And let's remember, these rules come from the SEC's creation out of the Great Depression and the stock market crash, specifically to give small investors the ability to confidently invest their money in the stock market and getting the information that they need is critical for small investors like you and many others to be able to engage in investment confidently.
Well, I'm glad you make that point, that proxy advisors are not dictating outcomes, but they are empowering investors, large and small, with information they would otherwise lack and need. And that's all it is. So critics argue that ISS and Glass Lewis yield outside influence. Address this. But is it not the case that their recommendations are just that, recommendations, and that these investors still make their own voting decisions? Is that?
That is correct. So we vote all our proxies at U.S. companies. We subscribe to both ISS and Glass Lewis to get information, and my team review that information as we make our independent decisions. So their advice is just advisory. Most of the time, they side with management when there is a difference between management and proposal bringers. And it's worth remembering that the shareholder proposals themselves are advisory. They don't dictate policy to companies. They let management know the opinions of their shareholders, and the vast majority of the time, they are advisory as well.
Now, Mr. Landers, what barriers do entry exist for new proxy advisory firms, and what can Congress and regulators do to foster more competition without undermining the independence of the advice provided?
This is a great question, and I think would be a great topic for the committee to explore how to encourage more information to be provided. As was mentioned, some new firms are coming on to the marketplace. I don't know that we'll subscribe to Mr. Ramaswamy's service, but of course he should be able to provide it and give more information to investors. But the answer can't be less information for shareholders and investors. It's got to be more.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Gentleman yields back. I now give myself 5 minutes. Witnesses. For many small and medium private companies considering an IPO, the decision often comes down to whether the benefits of accessing public markets outweigh the risk of compliance. But as we have seen in recent years, the shareholder proposal process can be dominated by a small group of activist investors advancing niche political agendas that have little to do with long-term value creation. At the same time, proxy advisory firms wield outsized influence over voting outcomes and operating with limited transparency and potential conflicts of interest. So together, these dynamics can create an uncertainty and additional costs that make public markets less attractive. So, Mr. Copland, can you explain why the existence of both radical shareholder activists and proxy advisory firms can be a deterrent for small and medium cap companies that are looking to go public?
Certainly. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got these activist forces empowered by, an SEC rule that are trying to tell you how to run your business. And it's important for shareholders to have oversight, but why do we have shareholder voting rights? It's not to create mini democracies with companies. You don't have to be an expert, I say this in my testimony, you don't have to be an expert in public choice theory to understand that, it's hard for the political process to work efficiently. It's good that we have representation here, but this is not a body that's known for its efficiency. Businesses need to be efficient. So if you're trying to run a business, I mean, certainly we want them to come to public markets. It's a good way to allow original founders of the companies to get liquidity. It's a good way to allow everyday people on the street to get a piece of those returns. And when we're making it harder and harder for these public companies to do that, it hurts the average investor out there as well as the company's returns themselves.
Sorry, as we have seen in recent years, the proposal process has been overtaken by activists who file dozens of proposals, many of them pushing political or social agendas that are far removed from adding shareholder value. Boards are spending hundreds of hours each proxy season dealing with these kinds of proposals, and while companies are dragged into debates over climate policy, DEI, or other issues that have no place in the boardroom. This politicization undermines the very purpose of shareholder oversight. So, Mr. Mueller, how do you distinguish between a proposal that is a legitimate tool for corporate oversight and one that is an illegitimate tool to make a political statement?
Sure. Well, certainly corporate governance is the relationship between boards and shareholders, and we've talked about some of the good corporate governance shareholder proposals. But when proposals start interfering with how a company is running a business, and not just asking for information about that, but really seeking to dictate what actions they take, whether the company is pursuing a certain climate change strategy or not, and really remove that from relevance to the company business, those proposals are clearly an activist proposal.
Okay. In recent weeks, the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Texas, my state, entered a preliminary injunction against the Texas law, SB 2337, which would bring transparency to the proxy duopoly by requiring these firms to file disclosures when their services are based on non-financial factors such as ESG or DEI considerations. Recommend a vote contrary to company management's recommendation to provide conflicting advice across clients. So, Mr. Copland, again to you. What benefits do you see as a result of this legislation, if implemented, and how can transparency bring balance to proxy advising?
Yeah, I think it's valuable to have transparency in this market too, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we have these voting rights because of agency costs. The people running the businesses aren't necessarily gonna act in the best interest of the shareholders. That's why we want these voting rights. But these proxy advisors have more agency costs. So, ultimately, I think a federal solution here would be better. But it makes sense that in the absence of federal action or with legal contestation and withdrawals of various federal action in this, that a state's going to stand up for it. And again, corporate governance should be a state-level question. Disclosure, this is what my Yale law professor Roberto Romano called the genius of American corporate law. Disclosure at the federal level, substantive rights at the state level, this has worked. This is why we dominate world capital markets, and all of these trends are undercutting the secrets of that success.
Thank you very much. I yield my time back. The gentleman from Illinois, Dr. Foster, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses. I'd like to start by just pointing out that lengthy proxy statements, as was pointed out by Chair Hill, are not necessarily an intrinsically bad thing by themselves. If I looked at the 4 companies he talked about where the length of the proxy statements had gone up by several 100%, well, the market cap of the companies involved have gone up by well over 1,000% over the same time period. So it's not necessarily a trend that's out of scale with the increased complexity and size of their operations. Also, in the future, all of the shareholders are going to do what we're already doing already, which is to ask your personal AI agent to summarize these complex proposals. And they'll look at them in whatever level of detail they're comfortable with and want. And so it will be possible to get, for the average shareholder, to make a decision on the basis of the amount of information that they can actually absorb. So I think that same point applies to very complex regulations, where we're going to be able to use AI to tolerate very complex regulations because of the ability to chew through the complexity. I'd also have to say that I am in favor of making some tweaks to this. In particular, when I looked over the list of the requirements to bring forth a proposal, the point that you have to be a long-term holder, I think, is fundamental. I am very concerned about sort of the rise of meme stocks that I have with completely disconnected share price from any plausible future revenue stream from the companies. And that, if I was going to choose what hearing to have, that would be it, because that is generating huge misallocation of capital in our country. And so, and I would put not only GameStop but Tesla in that bin. No, this is not investment advice. I just want to make that clear. Another point is that political ideas have financial impact on companies, and you can't really hide from it. This is, we see that in the company I started 50 years ago that now manufactures most of the theater lighting equipment. when our country behaves badly. You know, we saw this when President Bush got us into the war in Iraq by telling a bunch of our allies things that turned out not to be true, that we found foreigners simply did not want to buy American products. And if you ask yourself, why is it that we're now in our 6th month of manufacturing contraction since the start of Liberation Day? And this is not new. It's a repeat of what happened in the first term of the Trump administration, where his policies put us into a manufacturing recession 1 full year before COVID hit. Okay, so reputational risks are real, and a company's stance on the issues of the day matter certainly to their customers of these companies, and that hits the bottom line. So I think it's a mistake to imagine that companies can hide from these things. And so, let's see. I was interested, Mr. Lander. You referenced in your remarks that actually, if you look at companies that have had some of these DEI proposals go through, that it hasn't been bad, which is sort of the narrative I'm hearing from the other side of the aisle. Can you say a little bit about the actual research and the numbers here?
Yes, thank you, Congressman Foster. So an independent study, I mentioned something specifically looking at shareholder access to the company proxy to nominate directors. That came through the work of the New York City pension funds before I got there. And independent analysis found that it added 0.5% to shareholder value at the companies who adopted it, potentially adding up to billions across the market. And separate from that, a group of business professors at the NYU Stern School of Business evaluated 1,000 studies and found that 58% showed a positive relationship between environmental, social, and governance efforts and corporate financial performance. 13% had neutral outcomes, and only 8% had negative effects.
Yeah. So then, however, I think that there should be maybe some adjustment of the threshold by how significant an issue this is for a reasonable number of the shareholders. And are there simple tweaks? Yes, Ms. Keel, maybe are there some simple tweaks to simply increase the threshold so you have to make sure this is a major issue for more of the shareholders?
Sure. I mean, I think that would be the kind of easiest and most straightforward, right? To make sure that somebody who's submitting a proposal has the, as Mr. Copland said, an economic skin in the game, to make sure there's an alignment of interest. So that would be, I think, the simplest. But I think there are other ideas too, just about the resubmission thresholds, thinking about, whether or not significant social policy should be something that the SEC is deciding, or is that something that a company should be thinking about? Because the reality is that they're actually already thinking about all of these political issues, the tariffs, et cetera. They're thinking about those issues deeply in the boardroom before these proposals even come about.
Yeah, and so I think that also strengthening the whole...
Gentleman's time is up.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from the great state of Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My bill, H.R. 3402, would amend the Exchange Act to require that institutional investment managers file an annual report showing how they voted and their alignment and consideration of proxy advisor recommendations. It would also require that institutional investment managers with over $100 billion in assets under management be required to clarify that shareholders are not obliged to vote every item and to conduct an economic analysis that a vote is in the investor's best economic interest. Mr. Copland, can you please explain the relationship between institutional investment managers and proxy advisory firms? In other words, why do institutional investment managers hire proxy advisory firms to start with?
Well, because it's an extremely complicated thing to vote on all these proxy ballots. I mean, Comptroller Lander talked about they have 10,000 or some odd investments. That's true for a lot of these institutional investors. And they don't really get a competitive advantage. It doesn't help their investment return to be a better voter. So a really large family of companies, the Vanguards, the BlackRocks of the world, they have teams on this. Smaller institutional investors don't, as a general rule, or at least a lot of them don't. And so they need help to execute this. So there is an economic rationale there. They've also been prodded that way, as was discussed earlier, by both DOL rulemaking in the ERISA context as well as by the SEC in 2003, which sort of created this demand by for a while there at least, giving a safe harbor to rely on this investment advice.
Okay. Can you explain what is robo-voting and Why is it used by institutional managers?
Yeah, robo-voting is basically just a catchphrase to discuss, we're going to basically effectively outsource our voting to the proxy advisor. And we commissioned a study by Professor Paul Rose in 2021 that looked at this, and we found a significant percentage of the market that was doing this, which is why when we studied ISS in 2012, we saw that for these precatory shareholder proposals, about 15% of the voting total was de facto controlled by ISS.
Okay, so instead of just taking advice from the proxy advisory firm, they're just handing their vote over to them.
Right, they're not making an independent assessment.
Okay. Could robo-voting harm the clients of institutional investment managers? Could it harm their overall returns?
It could. The complication of this question is that for the individual firm, the answer is probably not, because you're a small percentage of the vote. You're not likely to have an outcome determinative vote on any of these questions. In the aggregate, I think it harms it, and part of what it's doing there is we're basically creating this Rockville, Maryland-based business owned by the German stock market,
right,
is effectively driving 15% of the vote for all the publicly traded companies. I mean, that's huge.
That is huge. Why would a disclosure requirement for large institutional investment managers concerning whether they have engaged in robo-voting be useful?
I think it's useful because it enables individuals and institutions that put their money with those firms to know that that's happening, right? And it could create some pushback. It's a softer form approach than totally banning this sort of thing, and there's some bills out there that are floated on that as well. I think disclosure is a good disinfectant in general, and I think it's a relatively soft touch approach, but one I think would be quite useful.
So you talked about 15% being from a German-owned organization, right? Is that theoretically then bringing European ideas and interest and standards into the American marketplace instead of these investment managers making their own votes and decisions?
Well, it certainly could be. That's the risk. And there's conflicts of interest in all directions for the way ISS and to some degree Glass Lewis, the other big player, operate as well. I mean, there was an article in the Free Press just recently that NVIDIA has a larger market capitalization than the entire German stock market. Wow. And yet the German stock market owns the proxy advisor that controls 15% of the vote here.
Wow, that's amazing. Last question. Do you have any other ideas for regulatory reforms that could reduce the influence of proxy advisory firms without imposing excessive cost on the institutional investment managers or stockholders?
We have a lot. The time's limited to go through them all, but I reference in my written testimony a paper I co-authored with David Larker and Brian Tayan at Stanford in 2018 that went through this as the SEC was looking at this, and they did a rulemaking in 2020. And then it was partially rescinded with the administration change, and they've been in court, and 3 different circuits have been opining on it. So it's kind of a mess, but which is why it'd be good for this body to act.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. I yield back.
Thanks.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlewoman from the great state of Ohio, Ms. Beatty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today. I just have a couple questions that I want to try to get through. Mr. Lander, as you know, many of the attacks on shareholder advocacy and even ESG investing argue that these are extraneous, immaterial issues with no relationship to a company's bottom line. And I believe you strongly disagree with these allegations that you are hurting companies financially. Can you explain your perspective on this?
Well, first, I find it especially funny when people attack ESG as not relevant to corporate governance when the G stands for governance. So outlawing ESG proposals, but saying, no, we're fine with a proposal about executive compensation or the role of the board. I mean, just read the words. Like, that's what governance is. Attacks on ESG are attacks on corporate governance. That's what they are. And then I thought, actually, that Representative Foster made this very clear. There's this idea that if you say pecuniary, somehow you're excluding everything I don't like, and only including profit makes no sense at all. You're evaluating risks like, will there be new regulation by Congress on some area that might be affected by the business we're investing in. If, we had concerns at Tesla when Elon Musk left as CEO and there was no CEO, but we also had concerns that if he was pursuing action that was going to make it harder to sell EVs through action he was taking here, that was going to be bad for EV sales. Well, that's pecuniary if you're a Tesla investor. So there is simply no way to draw a neat line, and that's the job of investors, to evaluate this broad set of regulatory and operational and legal and governance and, sure, environmental and workplace risks. Why stop investors from getting all the information that they need to make their own decisions? If other investors don't want that information, that is fine. I'm not telling them how to invest, but I don't understand why members of Congress are trying to tell me how to achieve my fiduciary duty to my beneficiaries.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Foster, because I think that was a good segue and allowed you to respond. Let me move on. I'm going to stay with you on this next question. While numerous red state treasurers and financial officers have written companies calling them to abandon working together on climate change or to end their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, I understand that financial officers in blue states have also written to companies they own to invest in investment managers that they use, urging them to stand firm in their support for sustainability programs, citing that it also promotes long-term shareholder values. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on why these financial officers are taking public stands in support of maintaining these programs.
Thank you. Let's just use BlackRock for an example for a moment. So in a letter to investors several years ago, Chairman Fink wrote, "Climate risk is financial risk." Now, everyone knows climate risk is financial risk. You can choose to evaluate it as you see fit. You can have a different political point of view on it. But of course, climate risk is financial risk. You might be a utility company, and if there's more wildfires in your area, you might be accused of causing them, or you might have to move your infrastructure to address them. So that doesn't seem like a complicated or political statement. And yet, red state treasurers declared war on BlackRock and threatened to divest or hold them accountable legally if they didn't back off of the simple idea that climate risk is financial risk. And I'm sad to say that what that has led to is a walkback of voting for proposals simply to provide disclosure. The proposal I mentioned that JP Morgan Chase ultimately agreed to, BlackRock did not vote for at other companies, denying its customers and other investors simple disclosure.
Okay. Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, and International Financial Institutions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. As chairman of the National Security Subcommittee, CFIUS and its screening authorities grabbed my attention. Foreign investments that could threaten our national security are supposed to get scrutiny. In the case of ISS and Glass Lewis, both foreign-owned companies with an extremely outsized impact on proxy voting in our capital markets, they haven't been subjected to CFIUS review. ISS, founded in the United States back in 1985, is now majority owned by Germany's Deutsche Börse Group, the powerhouse behind Frankfurt's stock exchange. That's a foreign-owned entity calling shots in how America's institutional investors vote trillions of dollars worth of U.S. shares. On May 10th, 2024, my colleagues, Congressman Andy Barr and Congressman Brian Stile, urged Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to have CFIUS review this acquisition. Yet here we are, over a year later, picking up the pieces from the previous administration. Then there's Glass Lewis, started in San Francisco in 2003, but snapped up in 2021 by Peloton Capital Management, a Toronto-based private equity firm. ISS and Glass Lewis aren't small outfits. Together, they dominate 97% of the proxy advisory space, influencing votes on everything from board elections to ESG mandates that shape corporate policies and significantly influence America's capital markets. In a world where we're laser-focused on foreign influence in critical sectors like tech and infrastructure, why aren't we properly screening foreign companies that control corporate governance in our country? Could these ties inject biases, say European-style green mandates or Canadian anti-growth policies, into U.S. boardrooms, undermining American competitiveness? We need transparency and safeguards to ensure these firms aren't advancing agendas that put foreign interests ahead of American shareholders. Look, the shareholder proposal process under Rule 14a-B or 14a-8 was meant to give real shareholders a say in how companies they own are run, holding boards accountable and driving long-term value for America's retail investors who are saving for retirement. But under the Biden administration and SEC Chairman Gary Gensler, it's been turned into a playground for activists and special interest outfits shoving their ideology and political crusades down the throats of companies that just want to focus on growing their business and raising capital. Why go public in America when you can dodge this regulatory circus? Congress has to get in the game with real reforms to Rule 14a-8, jack up ownership thresholds so you've got actual skin in the game and a holding period, beef up exclusions for this irrelevant ordinary business meddling, and slam the door on resubmissions for proposals that keep bombing us at the ballot box, all propped up by two proxy advisory kingpins. And speaking of those kingpins, ISS and Glass Lewis, with their 97% stranglehold on the market, they're the real enablers here, steering institutional votes like puppets without a shred of accountability or transparency. Their recommendations are really activism masquerading as advice, turbocharging robo-voting. And it's time to break this duopoly and let free markets actually work. Mr. Mueller, you've seen thousands of proposals up close. Why has the number of social and environmental ones exploded, and why do they mostly fail but keep coming back?
The factors here are really the professionalization of the shareholder proposal process. There are the advisors out there deemed representatives that are out marketing themselves and saying, we will handle the shareholder proposal process. You can sit back and we'll submit this proposal. And they're not just asking for information, they're trying to influence outcomes and saying, this is what we've done.
With their effort to influence those outcomes, do you worry about, threats to American interests or even national security?
Certainly I do, because they are focusing on one aspect of a company's operations. The management, who also has fiduciary duties to all the shareholders, to all shareholders, know the company best. They, as Mrs. Keel has said, have often already considered these issues. They're often addressing the issues the way they view best for all shareholders.
Thank you so much. Mrs. Keel, I'd love to talk to you about your work at Exxon. And in their case, BlackRock voted shares that seem to conflict with Exxon's interests, but certainly advance BlackRock's. And so we have a large range of questions that I'll address for the record. And I have some for you too, Mr. Copland. My time's expired and I yield.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses. And I want to just preface this by acknowledging that I'm going to be a little bit pedantic. But this conversation is, I'm trying to find a polite way to say this, it's really dumb. Let's just acknowledge some things that should not be debated, but I can't believe we're suggesting they're not true. Shareholders are actually the people who own companies. The executives of a company serve at their pleasure. They are tasked to carry out the will of those shareholders. They are custodians of shareholders' investment, but they are not actually the people in charge. And shareholders are not monolithic in terms of their interests, in terms of how they define value. Hearing my colleagues say the only thing that matters is shareholder value, what the hell does that mean? Maybe I'm a shareholder who thinks that a company's free cash flow should go to paying dividends. Maybe I'm a shareholder who thinks that value would be maximized if we reinvested that cash flow. Maybe I'm a shareholder in Kodak who thinks we should be pivoting to digital photography because you're committed to a technology that isn't going to survive. Maybe I'm a shareholder in a car company who thinks we should be pivoting to EVs. It doesn't matter whether you're right. You have different opinions about value. And the way that companies adjudicate those disputes is to have a high-functioning board, executives who are competent, people who surface their opinions. We try to resolve them in some collaborative fashion. And if you can't resolve them in some collaborative fashion, ultimately you go to a majority vote. This is not freaking complicated, right? Now, the idea that some voters are more worthy of having their opinions heard than others, some voters, only the ones we agree with, understand what value is, I guess that's on brand for the party of January 6th, but that's not actually the way that you make good decisions, right? So I say this not as a member of Congress. I say this as someone who spent 16 years as a CEO, who ran a company where I was a minority investor because I didn't have the couple $100 million that we needed, so we had a bunch of other money that came in. And sometimes I disagreed with our investors. Sometimes I persuaded them of my opinion. Sometimes they won. Sometimes I won. I maintain I was probably right more often than I won. But it didn't matter. Right? I didn't have the votes. And our board understood, and I understood, that sometimes my economic interests were at odds with the shareholders, right? Now, I could have come to Washington and said that as an activist for the interests of minorities, I will come here and represent our nation's poor, underappreciated CEOs. But I don't think that's actually the way economy works. So Mr. Mueller, I guess, do you agree that there are conflicts of interest and that, I don't know, like, when Enron collapsed, was a part of that because of board oversight failures and conflicts of interest with management? Just yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. And do you agree that it's important for boards to have independent directors who are distinct from management?
Yes.
Okay, good. So does the New York Stock Exchange, so does NASDAQ. That all makes a lot of sense. Ms. Keel, would you agree that transparency in executive compensation is a good thing to have in corporate structures?
Yes.
Would you agree that shareholders should have a say on board of directors' compensation?
Yes.
Under the Dodd-Frank Act, are companies legally required to act in response to a shareholder vote on executive compensation?
No.
No, they're not. They're non-binding advisory opinions. In general, are companies legally required to take action on shareholder proxies?
Technically, no, but effectively, yes.
Well, according to your firm, said, quote, shareholder proposals are typically advisory in nature and not binding on a corporation.
That's technically
That is
true.
all my experience. That is the law. We're talking about the law. We're not talking about technically. We're talking about should we change the law, and we are in agreement that the law does not actually say these proposals are binding. The law says they are advisory. They get factored in, and then we have a high-functioning board. Mr. Copland, you had said earlier that I think you had a just on public choice theory, and that Congress proves that you shouldn't just decide things by majority vote. That's not how boards work. As we just established, the law says that these are advisory opinions. So we're sitting here having this whole conversation about a boogeyman who doesn't exist. This conversation is about, do shareholders have rights? Do shareholders own companies? And do they have any rights to express their opinions of value in corporate boardrooms? Mr. Lander, you want to add anything here? Am I missing anything as a fiduciary?
That was very well said.
I hope our next hearing is not dumb. Yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank Chairman Hill and Ranking Member Waters for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for taking time out of your schedules to be with us today. Mrs. Keel, I wonder if you might like to expand on the response there to Mr. Caston about the nature of the issue.
So it's correct that most of the shareholder proposals and the say on pay are technically non-binding, but the reality of how companies are dealing with these is that if they were to pass, there would be immense pressure, and most of that is coming from the proxy advisors, actually. So if a company were to pass or if the shareholders were to vote in favor of one of these shareholder proposals, which is admittedly pretty rare, companies, even if they thought it was a bad idea for the company, would feel this inherent pressure and tension and grapple with the impact, which would be votes against their directors from the proxy advisors' recommendations.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Mueller, how transparent is the SEC's no-action process, and are there consistent principles, or do outcomes shift from year to year?
Thank you. If I can just add to the last response, I want
Please.
to note that under Glass-Lewis's proxy voting policies, if a proposal gets a vote above 30%, not a majority, then the board is expected to take some type of action or risk having glass-loose recommend votes the following year. So some of what we're hearing is not how it operates in the real world. The SEC's proxy rules have really shifted over time, shifted with the political winds. As Mrs. Keel has said, they use vague terms that are open to interpretation and really complicate and make the process more expensive for both proponents and companies.
Thank you. I appreciate that insight. And so, Mrs. Keel, back to you. Can you please explain why it would be useful to raise the resubmissions thresholds that are currently in Rule 14a-8I-12?
Sure. So, I think we use the word shareholder democracy a lot and wanting to protect shareholder rights. And I think, the resubmission threshold is so important because if shareholders vote against something 9-1, 9 against, 1 for, and we let the proposal go back on the ballot the very next year, what does it mean to have a voice, right, for those 9 shareholders who voted against it? Why are we putting it back on the ballot when it was very clear that there was not support for this? So I think that's the first point, is really respecting a shareholder's vote. The other thing that I think we need to really think about carefully as we, consider whether to revise the standard is, what does it mean to be substantially similar subject matter? So it's not just the number of the threshold, it's how it's applied. What is the scope? Is it a carbon copy? Is it a general topic? That's something that we would need a lot more clarity on, because right now the SEC applies it so narrowly.
Sure, and I think as a shareholder who actually reads these things and tries to be thoughtful in my responses, I think we all have to acknowledge that when we ignore that the shareholders have rendered a verdict, if you will, yet it comes back, the inevitable inclination is to think, okay, this issue must have more support than it appears to, right? That's just kind of a natural human response, is that something that keeps getting put back in front of you is going to, kind of persuade, if for no other reason that it's presence. Do you agree with that?
Completely.
And does the outcome in these things reflect that kind of natural human tendency?
Yeah, absolutely. It puts a magnifying glass on the issues, and that's the point of my testimony, of that you get to basically buy this megaphone and this platform to put forward these, sometimes important issues, but not necessarily relevant to a company. And I think that it can kind of distort what companies should be really focused on.
And Mrs. Keel, again, do the procedural requirements for a company to exclude a proposal create an excessive and expensive burden, even for proposals that are clearly non-material? Can you explain why this is?
Absolutely. So there are 3 things. One would be the fear of the proxy advisors, right? So if you know for a fact that a proposal is not accurate, maybe they didn't have enough shares, they missed the deadline, some sort of clear procedural deficiency, companies will still go ask the SEC for their official no action relief, because they're afraid that the proxy advisors are not going to vote against their directors for not doing so. Then they're also afraid of the shareholders themselves and bringing some sort of litigation and joining their annual meeting, which would be an absolute disaster kind of in corporate world. And then they're afraid of making the headlines, right? If you go against the grain and do something that's different, it can be problematic.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Diversity, equity, and inclusion matter. Diversity means all people, veterans, LGBTQ, women, rural communities, Black people. Equity means fair access to opportunities. And inclusion means having a real pathway to the American dream. No executive order from Donald Trump is going to change that, and certainly no legislation from my Republican colleagues will, but that does not stop them from trying. Republicans are proposing bills that would make it harder or even impossible for shareholders to increase transparency around diversity hiring and inclusive workplaces. Shareholders want this information because study after study has affirmed that diverse teams create more money for companies. They're more innovative and are better and faster at making decisions. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is good for business, and it is good for the economy. Mr. Mueller, does Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher value the practice of diversity and inclusion? And just a simple yes or no.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I would like to enter into the record this webpage from Gibson Dunn entitled Diversity and Inclusion.
Without objection.
Mrs. Keel, you are a partner at Jones Day. Does your firm value the practice of diversity and inclusion? Just a simple yes or no.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I would like to enter into the record this webpage from Jones Day entitled Inclusion.
Without objection.
Comptroller Lander, do you, as New York City Comptroller, value the practice of diversity and inclusion in your office?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you for your express commitment today. I also want to commend you on your statement in February, pushing back against Trump's attacks on DEI, and I would like to enter that statement into the record.
Without objection.
Now, it is really wonderful to see this type of agreement, bipartisan agreement, by Republican and Democratic witnesses here today. However, the fact remains that the fiscally irresponsible policies from the White House, Republicans in Congress, are pushing people out of the workforce. Unemployment is on the rise, and Black women are bearing the brunt of the job losses. But what else is new? We bear the brunt of everything. Black workers are the last hired and the first fired. The alarming spike in Black women's unemployment is the canary in the coal mine, a devastating warning of where our economy is headed. That is exactly why I wrote a letter to Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell calling on the Fed to do its job and honor their statutory mandate to promote maximum employment and address this crisis for Black women. But it's not just the Fed who must take action. The SEC must too. Comptroller Lander, do the Republicans' proposed changes to SEC rules help or hurt transparency for shareholders?
They hurt transparency for shareholders.
Thank you. We need policies that empower shareholders and protect investors. Diversity, equity, and inclusion matter. It's good for business, it's good for families, it's good for the economy, and the data supports it. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The gentlewoman from Michigan, the Republican Conference Chair, Ms. McClain, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure I'm in the right hearing. We're here to talk about proxy advisors. Am I? Okay, just making sure. All right. Let me start by saying this. This is my kind of stance, opinion, and I'd like to have a conversation around it. It seems to me that two proxy firms should not be deciding how trillions of dollars in shareholders' votes are cast. Would you agree with that? Anyone disagree with that? Thank you. Yet today, every American thinks they're investing in the market. But their votes are actually being hijacked and dictated by unelected, unaccountable, foreign proxy advisors. This is not, in my opinion, shareholder democracy. Instead, it's concentrated power that is unchecked, and it undermines the integrity of our capital markets. I believe proxy advisors should stick to providing what they do best: research, right? They were designed, their job, their goal is research. They should stick to their job, research, right? I don't believe they should act as shadow regulators of corporate America. I don't know if I'm going to get a bunch of disagreement there, but does anyone disagree with that premise that they should not act as a shadow regulator? Good.
They neither regulate nor dictate.
But you would agree with my premise that they shouldn't act as shadow regulators, correct? Or do you disagree with my premise?
They neither regulate nor dictate.
So that's a great answer to a question, sir, I didn't ask. Are you disagreeing with my premise, or are you agreeing with my premise?
You said they were dictating to shareholders how they
I
vote, and they
believe
don't
proxy
dictate to shareholders
advisors-
how they vote.
So let me rephrase it, sir.
Okay.
I believe that proxy advisors should stick to providing research and not act as shadow regulators of corporate America. Would you agree or disagree with that statement? It's a really simple question.
I agree, and they don't
Thank
do
you very
it.
much. Mr. Copland, would you agree proxy advisors, unaccountable, unelected firms, have too much power and direction of the U.S. public companies? Would you agree or disagree?
Agree.
Can you expand on why?
Because effectively, we're talking about controlling, 25% of the shareholder votes. They're non-transparent, they're non-regulated, they're non-American in ownership.
Wait, they're non-American. Wow.
No, one's
I wonder
owned
if they have
by-
any ulterior motives. I'm sorry, sir.
Yeah, one's owned by the German stock market, another's owned by a Canadian private equity firm, and they're deciding huge chunks of the vote in our stock market.
Karen, thank you. Doesn't that mean that millions of American votes are being hijacked by foreign proxy advisors? I mean, could one come to that conclusion? And not by the Americans who actually own the shares?
Well, I mean, hijacked may be a strong word, but I do think that de facto they're controlling it. They're controlling it because they're given that authority by a number of institutional investors, not the New York City funds, not BlackRock, but a lot of institutional investors are giving them that authority. And so there is a disconnect between the ownership rights. I'm really glad to hear a bunch of people talking about shareholder rights here, but there's a disconnect between those shareholder ownership rights and the actual execution of these votes in practice.
Amen to that. My question is, isn't that a betrayal of the fiduciary duty?
On behalf of the institutional investor, it's debatable. I mean,
Debatable.
at the end of the day, they're trying to execute these votes at low cost. I think it would be helpful to clarify. I mean, the SEC's done this in its own guidance, but it'd be helpful to clarify that these institutional investors are not required to vote at all. But they're trying to do this. They don't get an advantage from it. They don't get it's an infinitesimal almost disadvantage from being a bad voter. So they're sort of discharging it. And there are no fiduciary duties, let's be clear, for these proxy advisors.
Interesting. I just want to be clear. There's no fiduciary duties, responsibilities by the proxy advisors. That would be pause for
aside
concern.
from basic anti-fraud, no.
Yeah, very interesting, don't you think? Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, but I am out of time. Thank you for your witnesses. Thank you for your time.
The gentlewoman yields back, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to all the witnesses for being here this morning, and I want to give a special welcome to the Comptroller, because as a former elected city controller in Houston, I know the role, I know the business, and I know how busy you are, but thank you for taking the time for being here. And I also want to personally thank you for standing tall with the immigrants showing up to court in immigration court in New York. Like you, I've done that too. I've gone to visit our Houston immigration court, and it's just shameful what the current felon in the White House is doing to keep people from their day in court. So thank you for that too.
Thank you.
But tell me, this kind of silencing and criminalization of almost everything, I mean, I'm where Mr. Caston is. It's like, why are we going through all this? Why are we spending so much time on something when, frankly, all these lawyers at the table could just advise their clients to go private? If you don't want to deal with pesky shareholders, then go private. Then you don't have to worry about it. But no, they want it both ways. They want the dollars, they want the investment, and they want the control. But why is Wall Street just trying to push shareholders out? I mean, are these companies not rich enough?
The companies are doing well, the CEOs are doing well. I thought $56 billion was an extremely excessive CEO compensation. I never would have dreamed they would propose $1 trillion of executive compensation. It boggles the mind, but I
Could you just repeat that? I think everybody who's watching needs to understand the number of zeros involved in that when people are just worried about the costs of housing, the costs of healthcare, and the costs of even buying pens and pencils for their kids to go back to school.
So this is a board. So Elon Musk sought a pay package of $56 billion, which was by enormous amounts the largest CEO executive compensation ever, even though he wasn't working full-time at the company, which any board would expect their CEO to work full-time at the company for $560,000, much less for $56 billion. There was some objection from investors, so they re-domiciled the company in Texas. They are seeking to prevent shareholders from bringing shareholder resolutions. They are seeking to prevent shareholders from bringing securities litigation if their rights are violated. And now they are proposing to give him a $1 trillion payout, which I can only believe is like both to enrich him, but also to stick it in the eye of every hardworking person in America.
Well, I think it does, and it's not a bad part-time job. Where do I sign up? And it just baffles me that things like a shareholder proposal to get a report on the use of child labor law would be considered, outrageous, or a proposal for a company to conduct a health and safety audit regarding employee working conditions. I mean, I've seen so many of these. I mean, the words that are being used at this hearing: activists, out of control. I mean, if shareholders can't have a voice because they've invested in a company, well, then who can? It's again, if you really don't like the pesky investor, and I'm calling them pesky in a very gentle, dear way, then go private. And there's an exception for all this, isn't there? That things that are seen as harmful disruptions that distract from the core business. And I really, the economic relevance exclusion. I mean, who decides what's relevant or not?
So the SEC sides with management 68% of the time when management objects to shareholder proposals. So I would think, if anything, the balance might be tipped a bit in the favor of shareholders, not further to the CEOs.
Because I certainly would consider, if a business was starting in Houston in a flood-prone area close to the waters, they should disclose and really reconsider, and would support a proposal for them to reconsider if we know that Houston gets hurricanes and floods, and it's something also that they should disclose in their IPO, shouldn't they?
Of course.
So that's, to me, just makes common sense.
Almost all of this is about disclosure. Even on DEI, we brought resolutions asking people to disclose their EEO-1s, which they're already giving to the government. So give them to shareholders. Well, most now do. Disclose the matrix you use for determining who's on your board. The idea that is overreach when it's simple information investors use, I don't understand.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's discussion focuses on critical issues of transparency, market competition, and what can only be described as the swinging of the political pendulum in regulatory policy. The proxy advisory industry is effectively dominated by a foreign duopoly that controls approximately 97% of the market. That level of concentration creates systemic challenges for corporate governance and shareholder engagement. Since 2003, SEC rulemakings on proxy advisors have shifted significantly from one administration to the next, reflecting broader political and regulatory swings. In addition to these concerns, I want to focus today on a growing and often overlooked risk: the potential for foreign influence in U.S. public companies made possible by this proxy advisor duopoly. When two firms wield this much power with so little transparency, the risk is not just economic, it's also a national security concern. These firms frequently push ESG-driven proposals that may align more with left-leaning political agendas than with shareholder value or the long-term health of American businesses. Mr. Copland, do proxy advisory firms have clients with ties to foreign governments, sovereign wealth funds, or politically motivated international organizations? And if so, how transparent is that relationship to the companies they influence?
They have some relationship, right? I mean, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, for instance, is very active in influencing this. They dialogue, they colloquy with these proxy advisory firms. It's not very transparent, though, so it's hard to give definitive answers on exactly who might be influencing.
Thank you for that. What are the current consequences of this lack of transparency and disclosure?
Well, I think it's hard for regulators to know what's happening. It's hard for investors necessarily to know what's happening. And there's only a couple of these. I mean, the reality is they're not that big of businesses. They're valued high, but it's probably not just based on their cash flow. It's probably based on the control that they exert over the market. And we know that because from time to time they've been subsidiaries of publicly owned companies. So we know that, for instance, 15 years ago, it was reported from MSCI that ISS in its proxy advisory business got $11.5 million in profits. I mean, that's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money compared to 15% of the stock market.
Thank you for that. I want to turn briefly to the business model of large proxy advisory firms and the conflicts of interest that result. Firms like ISS not only issue proxy recommendations, but also sell consulting services to the same companies they evaluate, including through their ESG corporate rating service. This creates a financial incentive to issue recommendations that could drive more business, raising serious concerns about the objectivity of their guidance. In addition, some proxy advisors are affiliated with advocacy organizations that actively promote specific shareholder proposals, often aligned with particular political or ideological agendas. When the same firms are both shaping and scoring these proposals, it becomes difficult to separate impartial analysis from activism. That is a problem for transparency, for market fairness, and for the long-term interests of American investors. Ms. Keel, could you walk us through an example of this conflict of interest in practice and discuss the negative consequences that result for both the corporation and everyday shareholders?
Sure. So I think one important thing to address first, especially on the influence from abroad, is that they're incorporating European standards of investing into the standards that they are then imposing in the recommendations that they give to companies directly. So in Europe, they have an idea of double materiality. It's this idea that we can consider what's material to us and also to the outside world. That's just not the standard in the US. So it is applying an entirely different investment theory, essentially, of materiality to US companies. And so from a conflicts perspective, companies are subscribing to the services that tell them to do this. And if they do not comply, the implicit threat is, we will vote against your directors. So they're stuck between this rock and a hard place. They have to hire them, and they have to do what they say.
These are the same Europeans that shut down all of their nuclear power facilities because they were not clean and now buy dirty Russian oil. Interesting. As a follow-up to that, do you believe the SEC has the tools it needs to address this kind of conflict of interest, or should Congress consider additional steps to ensure proxy advisors remain neutral and accountable to shareholders?
There definitely needs to be some sort of regulation at federal level would be great. They fought tooth and nail against some really common sense regulatory, oversight, which would have just simply had them, not make false and misleading statements, right? And so that is what they were so against. So I think we need some explicit acknowledgement of the
Thank you for that. The proxy advisory industry holds too much influence with too little accountability. The absence of transparency, the potential for foreign involvement, and the presence of clear conflicts of interest create serious risk for public companies and for the strength of our capital markets. I am out of time, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Liccardo, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate all the testimony of the witnesses, particularly the written testimony. Mr. Mueller, I very much appreciate you going through in detail much of the existing regulation. I wanted to refer first to Ms. Keel's examples that were raised during both your testimony today and in your written statements. With regard to several proxy proposals relating to things like reproductive rights, geopolitical issues in China, gun sale regulation, Bitcoin investment, how many of those were actually adopted?
I don't have the exact passage rates, but I'm guessing
Were any of
none
them?
That's my guess, yes.
Okay, so none of them were,
Correct.
to your knowledge, were actually approved. And in fact, there are criteria that exist already, exclude proposals like these, most prominently that are relating to economic relevance under 14a-8, I-5, ordinary business that can mitigate micromanaging and so forth. And so I certainly appreciate that there is time expended, and I think that issue has been raised and a lot of resources expended. But fundamentally, the rules already exist to exclude many irrelevant proxy proposals. And in fact, the SEC appears to uphold management's decision to exclude them 68% of the time, according to Mr. Lander. So help me understand better what we're doing here. If the rules exist, why should Congress get involved if rules already exist to exclude irrelevant proposals?
So happy to take that one. You know, it's not required to go to the SEC for no action relief, but it's become the thing that companies do. And so to deviate from that, there's even an example from a long time ago before my time where a company said, I'm just going to notify the SEC of an exclusion. And the SEC said, you know, you've got to go through the normal process, even though it's not required and even though it's just guidance, it's not law. But there's this feeling among public companies that you don't want to rock the boat, right? It's not, it can be intimidating to make headlines. It can be intimidating to instigate scrutiny from the proxy advisors because the stakes are so high. So they will just fall back on this, you know, reliance on this system because, you know, that's what people are used to, and the alternative is, the unknown is too scary.
I can appreciate the point. I've been in public life for a long time. It's just the fact that executives are uncomfortable doesn't feel like that's enough to justify congressional action here. And I guess what I'm particularly concerned about, Mr. Mueller, I appreciate very much both your and Ms. Keel's excellent written statements, but what I'm particularly concerned about is narrowing the definition of relevance to the point where very relevant considerations would be included. For example, on page 14 of your written statement, you refer to the proxy proposal requesting JP Morgan Chase to disclose clean energy supply financing ratios. That is the financing of energy generation and renewables versus fossil fuels. Now, I know there's a wide variety of opinions here about climate change in this room and perhaps in America, but don't you agree that it would be critical for a lot of investors to understand how JP Morgan's executives have internalized the litigation risks, the regulatory risks, the long-term risks of how it's deciding to finance energy investments?
Sure. The issue on that is that, and I cannot comment on what JP Morgan was doing, but many of the other banks were already disclosing information about what they were doing with financing fossil fuel and non-carbon energy sources. And so the proposal was not so much about, hey, let's increase the disclosure. It was like the proposal was, we want you to do it this way, not the way that management thinks it's best to communicate with the shareholders.
Okay. So you don't disagree that disclosure itself may be quite relevant in that context? Because after all, BlackRock, in its 2021 Global Insurance Report, consulted 362 insurance company executives, and 95% of them confirmed that climate risk would have a significant impact on their portfolio construction over the next 2 years. So this is a relevant consideration, is that right?
Yes.
It is. Okay. I just want to make sure here in Congress, we don't decide to start excluding very relevant considerations from whatever we define to be appropriate proxy proposals.
I think the issue is what is relevant, and when under slab 14L in the Gensler administration, the first year that came out, only
Gentleman's time has
35%
expired.
of the proposals were excluded.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Mueller, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses very much. Last Congress, this committee pushed back against Biden regulators who imposed ESG mandates that elevate social or political agendas above material business decisions. This was most evident in the previous SEC's climate rule. Republicans were largely successful in restoring materiality and the guiding principle in disclosures and the shareholder proposal process. However, proxy advisory firms, through their concentrated influence, often function as de facto regulators by recommending ESG votes for shareholders when voting on board decisions. It's not about being against ESG as an investment choice. If individual investors want to prioritize environmental, social, or governance factors, that's their freedom. What we do is what we oppose is when these ideological views are mandated, when investors are forced to comply with burdensome regulations that prioritize political ideology over sound financial decisions. So, Mr. Mueller,
Chairman Gensler, under Chairman Gensler, the SEC issued Staff Legal Bulletin 14L, which required companies to include shareholder proposals on broad societal issues, even if they were immaterial to the company. What effect, in your view, did that shift have on companies and their shareholders?
It resulted in a lot of wasted effort by both the companies handling these shareholder proposals and by shareholders at large who had to review and vote on these proposals and overwhelmingly voted against them. They said they were a waste of time.
Thank you. From your perspective, advising large companies, as you do, what are the costs in terms of time and resources that you just alluded to for companies to respond to such proposals that have no material connection to its line of business?
Yes, and, both my written testimony and Mrs. Keel's testimony lays out all the actions that is that are borne by that. And again, it's important to bear in mind this may be a shareholder who has only owned $2,000 worth of stock. I bless those shareholders. It's good to have small shareholders, but when they are putting all that burden on the company at large, you have to question whether that's a rational system.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Keel, when the SEC refuses to block an ESG proposal for being immaterial, courts often treat that refusal as a green light. Doesn't that, combined with proxy advisors recommending yes votes, turn immaterial proposals into mandates in practice?
Yes, I mean, I think when you do not get, or whatever the SEC says is how all of the different stakeholders really interpret whether or not the proposal should be included or excluded, especially the proxy advisors. So if you were to go against what the proxy advisors recommend, I mean, there would be major consequences. And I think it's relevant that what Mr. Mueller has said before is that there's a 30% threshold that Glass Lewis imposes. So if a proposal gets 30% support, they expect you to publicly address how you have engaged with shareholders on the particular proposal. I think it's also kind of interesting that the shareholder proxies influence, we hear some numbers like 20, I commonly see the number 30% of what they control for a company. It really depends from company to company, but those numbers are suspiciously similar.
Okay, great, thank you. Mrs. Keel, you've advised companies facing ESG lawsuits. Do boards feel pressured or even threatened to engage with ESG proposals, even when their shareholders have rejected them?
Absolutely. I mean, but the real issue that I would like to also highlight, which I've said earlier, which is boards are grappling with these issues in the boardroom not every single day, but at every meeting, right? These are important topics when you see news about the tariffs or you see news about environmental issues. I mean, these are raised in the boardroom absent exactly what the proposal is putting forth.
All right, thank you. Mr. Copland, proxy advisory firms like ISS and Glass Lewis often recommend yes votes on ESG proposals, even when those proposals aren't material, and shareholders repeatedly reject them. Doesn't that amount to an ESG mandate in disguise?
Effectively, because of the way they treat this. As we've heard during this hearing, they'll no vote directors, even though it's an advisory proposal, they'll no vote directors if they don't reply. Sometimes even for minority votes, where a majority of shareholders say no, they'll no vote directors if the company doesn't respond.
And my understanding is the performance isn't that much worse off, but the idea of mandating and the problems that it causes is serious.
The gentleman's
Your
time
understanding
has
as well?
expired.
My time has expired. Yeah, you're back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member and the witnesses for appearing. Mr. Lander, I'd like to visit with you for just a moment, if I may, please. There are some CEOs who make more in a day than some of their employees will make in a year. There seems to be a belief among many that those who are wealthy need more to do more, and the poor can do more with less. Is it material for the shareholders to want to see a living wage paid to employees and for those shareholders to insist upon that by using the limited amount of authority that they have to have a living wage for people who are working and making it possible for CEOs to make these huge salaries. You just talked about the possibility now of $1 trillion. That's $1 trillion salary. I mean, that's more than the mind can imagine. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah. So I'll start from the people whose money I'm managing and who I represent. They are teachers and school crossing guards and secretaries and public hospital nurses and cops and firefighters and sanitation workers, like hard-working people who, largely because they organized in a union, secured retirement security. They're not making a lot of money every year, but we guarantee them this retirement security. So they're paying attention to how their money is invested. And what they mostly have the right to from me and as fiduciary duty is to make sure that it's invested well with good risk-adjusted returns. They know that companies will do better if those companies have good workforce management and live up to their own policies. So many of the companies that we invest in have policies that they respect the rights of those workers to organize a union, to seek to bargain collectively, and to have good workforce management practices. So I'll give the example on climate policies. It tends to be that our—
So talk to me about the living wage.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say there is all 5 of our funds, including the police pension fund and the firefighter pension fund, often vote for shareholder proposals asking companies, as they did at Starbucks, where we brought a proposal. We had heard that there were issues of workforce management, refusal to allow people to organize and bargain collectively. So we brought a proposal, and 52% of investors voted in favor of asking Starbucks to do an independent assessment of its workforce practices, including its adherence to international labor rights standards. And then the company agreed to do so and provided that assessment to its investors, including those teachers and cops and firefighters that I represent. That's all we're talking about here at its most aggressive. Usually those proposals don't get a majority. In this one case where they did, it resulted in a corporate assessment of its workforce policies so that investors could make wise decisions going forward.
I'm going to take it that you believe that it is acceptable for the shareholders to push inquiries that would lead to a living wage being paid to workers.
So let me distinguish, at the policy level, I'm a big advocate of living wage policies broadly across the economy and have advocated for them as law in New York City and nationally. As an investor, I have fiduciary duty to focus on risk-adjusted returns to shareholders, and so I focus on workforce issues broadly, because if you immiserate your workforce and you have such rapid turnover as Amazon does, for example, that's a risk, not only to the
I
workers,
agree, and let me
but to
just
investors.
add this as we close this. When we're making these decisions to pay the CEOs billions, we don't seem to get into the question of how this is going to have this level of adversity as it relates to the business model that the company has. But when we talk about the people who are making $7.25 an hour or some amount of money that CEOs will give as a tip as they leave a restaurant, it becomes a big issue. We seem to think that the poor can do more with less, and the wealthy, they need more to do more. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kim, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Welcome, witnesses. Thank you so much for being here. You know, in California, our drivers, custodians, local law enforcement, and other public employees rely upon the California Public Employees Retirement System to manage their pensions and ensure that they can have a comfortable retirement. Unfortunately, rather than being focused on securing the highest possible return for its members, CalPERS has been focused on left-wing politics and supporting changes to force companies to adopt these ESG initiatives. One way that we have seen companies forced away from focusing on their products and services is by burdening companies through the shareholder proposal process. I want to ask my question to Ms. Keel. What are the steps that a company takes when it receives a shareholder process or proposal?
Sure. So first it will decide whether it is actually substantially implemented already, whether it's considered it. It'll then go into whether investors have raised this as a particular issue that they actually care about. And then it'll assess what is the harm that could come from this, right? It's a risk mitigation analysis at the end of the day. So is it going to jeopardize legal privilege? Is it going to disclose some sensitive competitive information? Is it going to disclose sensitive employee information, which is what a lot of the reports would request? Is it legal? There are examples of shareholder proposals being put forth that would, if they were to be implemented, would actually be illegal. We've seen this in the insurance industry and with respect to diversity and equity and inclusion proposals. And then lastly, you have to evaluate whether it's actually going to harm the company, right? So then there are examples of proposals that are effectively trying to hurt a business. One example would be to a pharmaceutical company, asking them to stop issuing patents or do reduced patents. Another example would be asking an energy or oil and gas company to reduce Scope 3 emissions, since that would require them to reduce the sale of their actual products.
What about the costs that companies are burdened with when dealing with shareholder proposals that may not be relevant to the business activity?
So I think there are costs that the SEC has said it's, maybe upwards of $150,000. There have been other studies that put that at a top of, $600,000. But I think that that's actually, it's nice to have those dollars and cents, but it's really the intangible energy and effort that goes into these that is really hard to quantify. So that analysis that I went through, that's just a kind of drop in the bucket in terms of the focus.
Mr. Mueller, can you talk about if the investors are the ones that bear the burden of the costs and consequences of non-material shareholder proposals? Can you talk about that too?
Yes, they bear those expenses and typically vote down these proposals, particularly in recent years as the proposals have gotten more extreme, more prescriptive. The votes are dropping down, and large shareholders are coming to the company saying, "Why are we even having to deal with this?" And so they're not happy either.
Let me talk about another issue. Companies, they want to be focused on delivering great products or services and continuing to innovate. But when they spend thousands of hours attempting to deal with the shareholder proposal regarding whether they will go from plastic straws in their cafeteria to paper straws, that is vital time and resources that's taken away from improving the business and customer experience. And CalPERS should return to being focused on its stewardship of the retirement of my constituents and not supporting a left-wing political agenda. So another concern I have is with the duopoly in the proxy advisory market and ISS and Glass Lewis's lack of economic analysis. So in July of 2023, ISS testified that the firm does not generally conduct an economic analysis before providing a vote recommendation. And last year, Investment Stewardship Global Head of ISS stated that on that CNBC interview, that the firm leaves the investment thesis up to the investors. So I want to ask you a question, Mr. Mueller. Have you observed anything that would lead you to believe that ISS or Glass Lewis evaluates the specifics of each shareholder proposal at each company?
No, there's nothing in their voting recommendations report suggesting that they're evaluating other than intangible speculative risks.
Okay. When economic analysis is not the guiding principle of shareholder proposals, then it leaves one to question whether the guiding principle is, what the guiding principle is. So,
the gentlelady's time has expired.
Oh, can I just finish my sentence?
Go ahead.
The takeaway that I'm left with is that personal and political bias are what guide the recommendations of Glass Lewis and ISS. So it is also concerning to me that IS and Glass Lewis appear to have a significant conflict of interest. And I just wanted to share that and put it on the record, the concerns I have.
Gentlelady yields. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Richie Torres, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Republicans often accuse Democrats of, quote, politicizing capitalism. So I have a simple question for the Comptroller. Who's the most efficient allocator of capital, Donald Trump or the free market?
The free market.
Okay, because Republicans believe the answer to that question is Donald Trump. So it sounds to me like you're much more capitalist than your Republican critics. Republicans have no objections to socialism so long as it's Donald Trump doing the socializing. A wise person once said, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably on the menu. And Rule 14a-8 ensures that shareholders have a seat at the table. It promotes the democratization of corporate governance. It brings checks and balances, accountability, and transparency where none would otherwise exist. The purpose of securities law, as I understand it, is to correct information asymmetries and to level the playing field between issuers and investors. Mr. Comptroller Lander, do you worry, as I do, that the Stop Woke Investing Act would undermine the very purpose of securities law and radically restrict the flow of material information to shareholders?
Yes, I do.
And Republicans often accuse cities like ours, like New York, of, quote, woke investing. What were the most recent performance returns of the New York City pension system?
Let me get the numbers. We just announced at June 30th that for the year ending June 30th, we had one-year returns of 10.3%, exceeding the state standard of 7%, and saving about $2 billion for taxpayers.
So you saved $2 billion for taxpayers. And so under your financial stewardship, New York City has shown that it is possible to do well and to do good at the same time, that shareholder value and social responsibility can be mutually reinforcing. Now, under the Stop Woke Investing Act, the word material is radically redefined. It will no longer include, quote, any portion of financial risk that primarily relates to events that involve a high degree of uncertainty regarding what occur in the long-term future. And so with that definition in mind, I want to present the following hypothetical to you. I sit on the China Committee, and we in Congress have a bipartisan concern about rising tensions in the Taiwan Strait. So suppose I were a shareholder of the Taiwan Manufacturing Semiconductor Company, and I had a desire to file a shareholder proposal asking the company to disclose the possible impacts that an amphibious invasion would have on the advanced semiconductor supply chain in Taiwan. It would seem to me that under the Stop Woke Investing Act, my proposal would not qualify as material because it involves a high degree of uncertainty regarding what may occur in the long-term future. So let that sink in for a moment. An existential risk to the world's most critical and fragile supply chain would not qualify as material under the Stop Woke Investing Act. Is there any universe in which that makes sense to you as a fiduciary?
Investing is assessing risks exactly like this one, and I agree, as I read the bill, it would not allow you to ask a company where you were an investor to assess and disclose that risk to you.
Well, look, the cruel, almost Orwellian irony of this legislation is that the most material risk that a company can face, whether it be climate change or war, would no longer qualify as material under the law. And that, to me, makes a mockery of securities law. So I'm pleased, as a pensioner in the New York City system, I'm pleased with the 10% returns. Please doubling down on your winning strategy. I'll yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. I know it's been a long morning or now into the afternoon. Two proxy advisory firms, mostly through 3 index funds, are driving corporate governance across the entire economy. No one elected these firms, yet they wield incredible power. And to borrow a phrase from the progressives, they do it with other people's money. Mr. Copland, if BlackRock and State Street are voting tens of billions in retirement assets, most of it from ordinary Americans who never opted into ESG activism, do you see that as a distortion of shareholder democracy?
Yes.
Would you agree Congress needs to explore ways to restore some voice to the ultimate beneficiaries, the retirees and workers, instead of leaving it all to intermediaries and advisors?
Yes.
Thank you. The First Amendment doesn't let the government force people to take political positions, but though Rule 14a through 8, activist shareholders are forcing companies into political speech as the price of being public. That's compelled speech by another name. Mr. Mueller, Do you agree that many of these proposals are not about material business issues, but about forcing companies to take sides on divisive social debates?
Yes, we
Mr.
often see that.
Mr. Copland, you raised First Amendment concerns in your testimony. Would you expand on how compelled corporate speech under 14a-8 mirrors the kinds of unconstitutional compelled speech that the courts have struck down?
Yes, I mean, effectively, these companies are being required to put on their proxy ballots political statements that are drafted from people like in the New York City Comptroller's office, right? And you know, that clearly runs afoul of a lot of compelled speech doctrine. I mean, there's some uncertainty about how this applies in the securities. What's unambiguous is that the way this is operating in practice, there's viewpoint discrimination. And I point to that in my testimony where the National Center for Public Policy Research litigated this into the Fifth Circuit, and it was mooted, et cetera. But there was a situation where the SEC staff said you had to include on your proxy ballot a shareholder proposal talking about equal employment opportunity for sex orientation and gender identity. And the exact same language was used by a conservative group as a shareholder proposal saying viewpoint and ideology, and it said, no, you can exclude that, and a no action letter was granted. I mean, that's the sort of thing that should be troubling. It's a First Amendment issue.
That's right. Well, again, this gets back to the idea that it's more about compelling political speech versus getting back to the basics of, the actuarial component. Most retirees in Tennessee just want their pensions and 401k to be safe. They don't sign up to subsidize culture war battles, yet the proxies diverts resources away from shareholder value and onto politics. Ms. Keel, you gave the example of one shareholder forcing a company into expensive proxy fights over issues like DEI or gun policies. From a fiduciary duty standpoint, isn't that effectively transferring wealth from retirees to activists?
Yes, well, yeah, depends on whether it passes and they implement it.
Sure, absolutely. But the intent would be?
Yeah, so I think it's asking, it's a question of I think maybe a good example for this would be kind of climate targets, for example, right? Proposals are asking companies, a pizza company that I order my Friday night pizza from to impose Scope 3 climate targets. And so it's kind of hard to see the relevance to certain of these companies, and it ultimately kind of feels like an unsanctioned tax, really.
And I have more questions. I'm running out of time. I want to go back to this idea, Ms. Keel and Mr. Mueller. You both commented on the technically versus effectively with some of these proposals. So my colleague on the other side, technically was correct, but when you get back to the boardroom and how it's issued in the markets, please expand or put a fine point on technically versus effectively.
Sure. Companies don't want to be out there publicly opposing their shareholders. They want to be focusing on business and not being dragged into political debates. And so even oftentimes the vote is irrelevant. The shareholder has gotten the issue into the proxy statement, has forced the company to make a statement about it, and the shareholder doesn't really care what the vote is. They've achieved their purpose, and that's really kind of effective
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman from Michigan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all so much for being here. I just left a number of advocates, or maybe my colleagues like to call them activists, around the housing crisis. It was powerful speeches about just how terrible and horrific the housing crisis is across our country. And I'm getting back from there, and I'm thinking, well, I'm on Financial Services Committee. Somehow we're going to be able to address the housing crisis. No, that's not what we're doing here. Then I thought, okay, well, the president is shamelessly using his office for vast personal gain. I mean, I think he's doubled his net worth since last year, mainly through cryptocurrency and crypto corruption. And I'm just saying this because I'm like, why are we having this hearing? I always like to kind of dig deeper, and then I found out, oh, well, the anti-ESG, which for my residents listening, it means environmental social governance. These are, many of my colleagues will call activists because they have social causes and they want to make sure their money is not going to something they don't support. And it's because it's funded by big mega donors, the fossil fuel industry. It's true. You all know it. And figures like Leonard Leo and Peter Thiel. I mean, Mr. Copland, Manhattan Institute, and I would like to submit for the record a fact sheet on the Manhattan Institute from the Center for Justice and Democracy.
Without objection.
Thank you. You know, I think, $1.5 million from ExxonMobil and $3 million from the Koch brothers. You know, how do the public take that seriously when I have a community in Wayne County that hasn't met Clean Air Act standards in years, where our kids are literally being poisoned? They can't develop, their brains cannot develop if they're being poisoned. I say this because we're here because of mega donors. We're here to talk about this whole anti-ESG, whatever they want to call, movement. And, you know, this issue to me is fabricated, but the stakes are real in regards to people having disclosure and transparency. The retirement savings of hardworking families are on the line. And so, you know, Mr. Lander, can you discuss, you know, the issues here? I mean, I'm a person that does deeply care about the climate crisis and how the risk to executive compensation and that shareholder proposals can force companies, you know, to disclose that, and why those issues should be in the interest for investors.
I mean, I do think it's extraordinary that what's being demonized is the simple effort to disclose the basic risks that a company is facing. And we've heard this a few times today in ways that are so obviously relevant to the shareholders of that company. Of course, there's a broader set of questions that are critical here. But for many companies, their exposure to climate risk is a simple and straightforward issue. Yes, if you have most of your book of financing for fossil fuel financing, an investor might say, I think it would make sense to have more exposure to renewable energy and investment. And you could decide, do I want to keep investing here? Do I not want to keep investing here? And have that basic information. That's what's being demonized, not any requiring of changes, not dictating, not regulating.
I mean, they really want to muzzle people's First Amendment speech. I know you all don't see it that way. Do it all you want. You're getting funded by people. I mean, come on. I'm looking at you all and I'm telling you, these companies are not my constituents. The 12th Congressional District residents are, and if they want more disclosure and transparency, then they deserve it. Then what's the problem? I mean, somebody said that none of these even proposals pass, but you're all here because of Peter Thiel and Leonard Leo. You all know it. That's exactly why we're here, because they donate to my colleagues. This is why we're here. Nobody cares about what's going on with housing. Nobody cares about the fact that I'm literally fighting for Head Start program dollars. That's what people care about. And this is not like a political, this is me, the girl from Southwest Detroit, looking at this, growing up in the back shadow of the only oil petroleum refinery in the state of Michigan, Marathon Oil. And you're telling me that if a teacher and others that are concerned about this, that live in that neighborhood, can't have transparency and disclosures, can't have a say? But see, they call them activists because they politically disagree with them, and it's supposed to be like, most of them were activists before they got here. They were. They might have been activists on issues that I may disagree with them, but I respectfully disagree, because I'm like, that's your right to disagree. So, Chairman, I wish we could do more on housing. We could do more on issues of corruption, and I look forward to that. Thank you.
Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Dunn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Hill, and thank you for all of you joining us here today. I will say that inflation and rising costs is directly impacting people in the heart of the heartland, including in my home state of Iowa. So as opposed to just talking about it, let's get after doing something about it. This situation was made worse by proxy advisor firms and their robo-voting that put millions of Americans' 401k and pensions at risk. This is happening as half of Iowans rely on some type of retirement account to pay for their future, their kids, 429s programs, or simply to buy a home. So let's get to it. Mr. Copland, are you aware that only 2 firms control approximately 97% of the proxy advisory market, and how does this effective duopoly really limit investors' choices?
Yes, I mean, the percentage may or may not be exactly that, but it's a massive percentage. Over 90% of voting is controlled by the two foreign-owned firms, Glass Lewis and ISS. And you know, how does it limit choices? I mean, listen, it's a hard market to break into because it's not a big market where you're going to get venture capital throwing money in it. There's not a huge amount of money in it. They're paid a premium because people want control over the voting, not because it's a great business model. But it also makes it very subject to capture for that reason, because it's not a business that could get a lot of public buyback. No individuals hiring ISS or Glass Lewis. And so they can be sort of captured by these activist forces, the professional activist forces, and they make more money when they're more supportive of this environmental and social activism because the companies pay them to leave them alone, et cetera, et cetera. So.
And I think you're absolutely right here. These are both foreign entities influencing a U.S. market. Mr. Mueller, if investors are 20% more likely to oppose a management simply because proxy advisors recommend it, it doesn't show that these firms wield disproportionate power over the overall investor. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do, and it's not just correlation. There's evidence of causation. When these firms flip their votes, occasionally they do it. It's rare, but you see that 20% flip right away.
All right, so now that we've kind of laid the base ground for this, let's consider the influence of proxy firms over voting outcomes. I think you would agree, as you just highlighted, that the practice of robo-voting, especially how robo-voting works, is not only troubling, but where investors automatically adopt a proxy advisor's recommendation, silences the First Amendment rights of our retirees. I've got a bill out there. It's called Protecting American Savings Act. It requires the SEC to finalize rules prohibiting the use of robo-voting with respect to votes related to proxy advisors. So, Mr. Copland, I'm going to come back to you on this. Do you think this would help restore accountability of fund managers? Many of them are handling trillions of dollars in retirement savings.
Yes, as Mr. Copland said, particularly for many of the smaller administrators, there's no motivation for them to take the time to do an independent review and analysis and actually exercise their fiduciary duties before voting. Instead, they have blind reliance on the proxy advisory firms.
And I would highlight here, it also ensures that this voting is optional, which is important to protect our shareholders, particularly our retirees, from being dragged into these often very social-focused political fights, and allows them to just really focus on getting their retirement. Mr. Coleman, would you
I think
concur?
that's very important to do statutorily. I mean, the SEC's moved that way in guidance, but these proxy advisors came about in part because first the DOL and then the SEC said, well, you've got a fiduciary duty to vote, here's a safe harbor, and it really empowered these firms. And so now, while they've clarified this could always swing back, it could always change. So I think making it clear in statute would be very useful.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to be able to submit for the record the letter here to the American Securities Association that details proxy power proposal abuse and the reform rules that we could go that complement the bill.
Without objection.
I'd like to just, and now quickly talking about the SEC rules. Former Secretary Gensler expanded the definition of solicitation to cover proxy voting advice. Normally, solicitation means directly asking someone for their vote. Gensler went further. He said, even research or recommendations from proxy advisors should count. So just the thought process versus the actual. Mr. Coleman, do you believe that the SEC exceeded their authority by going from asking for it to just implying that people should be able to do this?
Yeah, I mean, the DC certainly just said that.
When they struck it down, you're exactly right.
But you know, that's why it's important for this body to act in this space, I think, because I do think that the proxy advisory firm should be regulated in some form.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Iowa yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lander, if I can direct a few questions to you, and thank you for being here today. The phrase globalize the Intifada is an anti-Semitic slogan that refers to a wave of terror that killed more than 1,000 Jews. Mr. Lander, Mr. Mandami recently said he'll, quote, discourage the use of the phrase globalize the Intifada, but has refused to condemn it as anti-Semitic rhetoric. You've also failed to outright condemn this phrase as anti-Semitic and a blatant call for violence against Jewish people, which is obviously surprising given that anti-Semitic violence, as you know, is at an all-time high in this country, including in New York and New Jersey, where I'm from. I just want to know if you condemn the phrase globalize Intifada as a call to violence against Jewish people.
I've made very clear on occasions that when I hear that phrase, what's ringing in my ears is violence against Jews in the Second Intifada and unfortunately here in the United States recently.
So you condemn the phrase? It's like a yes or no question. You're either for it or against it. It's given what you said, I assume.
I make clear that I think when people use it, they are saying open season against Jews.
So we should do everything we can to get people to stop using that phrase, correct?
I wouldn't want a law against the phrase. I guess what I would say when you say everything we can do, I make clear how I feel about it and what I think when I hear it. Would I want a law saying that it was banned? I would not.
So that you think we should allow that, and you think we should discourage it or condemn it? What do you think we should do on that phrase? You just don't want anyone, you won't even condemn the phrase? Even if you say we shouldn't have a law, do you condemn the phrase globalized intifada?
I mean, I've made very clear how I feel.
It's just a yes or no,
that
man.
Phrase.
It's not that hard.
But when you say anything we could do, are you saying that you think there should be legislation that would prohibit
This question,
people
sir,
or
I reclaim my
criminalize
time. This
people?
question is, do you condemn the phrase globalized intifada? It's a
Tell me
simple
what
yes
you
or
mean
no
by
question.
condemn.
You don't know what the word condemn means? You're a very smart
I'm
guy.
afraid it means I think there should be legislation making it illegal to say. And I hate it. I
Okay,
don't
fine.
like it. I don't
And
like
do
how it
you-
sounds.
fine. Do you
but if by
personally-
condemn you mean I would
You
support
can't
legislation
condemn-
making it illegal to say, I
Wait,
don't
I
think it should be
condemn.
illegal to
I
say.
condemn lots of
If
things.
you
I don't
mean,
think should
do
be
I think it's
legislation.
awful and I wish people wouldn't say it, then I
Got it.
condemn it. And if you mean, do I think it should be made illegal by legislation, then no.
Got it. So it sounds like I heard you say you condemn it. You personally condemn it. You would not say it. You think it shouldn't be said.
I would prefer people not say it.
Okay. Mr. Lander, it's surprising you're advocating for free market policies and good corporate governance, which I support. Do you believe the government should be running grocery stores in New York City?
I am supporting, as you know, Assemblymember Mamdani, and he is supporting 5 pilot grocery stores throughout the boroughs in order to address grocery store costs.
So you think government-run stores exempt from property taxes and rent, you're not worried they're going to hurt small businesses like local grocery stores that are owned by longtime residents and immigrants and others? Because they have to compete with the government-run ones.
I mean, we don't have enough information to know what the shape or the form of those stores would be and how competition would take place. I love my local bodega. I love my local grocery store. Yes, they are owned by immigrants. I want to see them thrive.
Right, it'd be tough if they were competing against socialist-driven.
But then we have many places in New York City that are food deserts and have no good grocery store providing decent, nutritious, affordable food. And in those places, I don't see any harm offering additional
You could have
options.
incentives, like we've had incentives in other places to encourage.
We have incentives. We have a program called the Fresh Program in New York City, which my office audited and found that it's a pretty ineffective incentive.
Got it. But having the government going in to run a grocery store is what you think is the solution?
In places where there currently are no grocery stores that are food deserts, what would be the harm?
I want to just talk about people from New Jersey who commute into New York to work, to see doctors, to spend money, and contribute to the economy.
We'd love to have them.
No, it's great that you love them. I mean, you obviously supported the congestion tax, which is hurting them. And the MTA, as you know, just recently announced that they will be increasing subway fares, the very mode of transportation you were suggesting commuters take instead of driving, which is part of what it's encouraged. Do you support those price increases at the MTA?
I support congestion pricing. As you know, we want to welcome folks from
What about
New
the
Jersey,
fare
and
increases?
we want to
The
pay
fare increases
for.
at the MTA. Do you support those?
I don't support
Subway
the fare increase at the MTA.
Okay, great. Because I worry that nickels and dimes, folks, and hurts a lot of people. Just like supporting a BDS movement would do the same thing and going after Israeli bonds and encouraging divestment, which would really hurt the economy of New York. And with that, thank you very much, and Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Gentleman yields. The chair of our subcommittee on capital markets, Ms. Wagner from Missouri, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to make clear to my friend, Mr. Gottheimer, that I absolutely condemn the phrase, globalize the intifada. So, as I know you do too. Now, to the topic at hand. Mr. Mueller, there you are, okay. I reviewed your firm's August 8th, 2025 report on the most recent shareholder proposal season. It caught my eye that 37 companies received a nearly identical proposal from the same proponent, and that these proposals made up 18% of all successful no-action requests this prior year. These numbers seem absolutely staggering to me, so I want to dig in a little bit more. Can you tell me briefly a little bit about this proponent? For example, what did his proposal ask that each company do 37 times?
Yes, this was an individual named Chris Mueller, no relation. And he submitted 3 different types of proposals, all really addressing a very technical issue about ownership of stock certificates in a certificate form instead of owning them through your bank or brokerage firm.
Was he selling something?
I'm sorry?
Was he advocating on behalf of something?
It was not clear why he was doing this, and he typically owned very little stock.
Yeah, how many shares of each company did the proponent typically own?
In most of them, he only owned 1 or 2 shares.
Yeah, so to be clear, the proponent only had 1 share of each company. This typically would not meet the Rule 14a-8 ownership threshold, correct?
That's correct, and you're right that those companies still had to go through all the process that you do.
So given that the proponent did not meet the ownership threshold, did companies ask the proponent to withdraw his proposal? What did he say?
Yes, many of my clients did. We always try to negotiate and engage with the shareholder proponent, and typically his response was, well, if you do what I ask, then I'll withdraw my proposal.
Well, if you do what I ask, wow, sounds like blackmail to me. To your knowledge, did some companies simply cave to his demand to purchase the software that he was pitching?
I'm not aware of any of my clients that did. He did say that some companies did, but I don't.
Some did, okay.
There's no
Glad
transparency
none
on
of
that.
your clients did, but some certainly have. If it was so clear that his proposal could be excluded, why did companies need to submit no action letters to the SEC? Because they did. And how do proxy advisory firms play a role in this?
Yes, so the proxy advisory firms have, both of them have policies that if a company excludes a shareholder proposal from their proxy statement without having either a court opinion or an SEC no action letter, that they will view that as bad governance regardless of the circumstances and will recommend votes against the directors.
Well, while this is just one of many examples, it clearly demonstrates, Mr. Chairman, just how broken our shareholder proposal process is. And under this flawed system, companies are often forced to waste valuable time and resources fighting proposals that are irrelevant to the company's bottom line, hurting investors and workers alike. Mr. Mueller, in your firsthand experience dealing with activist proposals and the bureaucratic hurdles that they create, what changes do you think are necessary to fix this system and ensure that investors' interests are put first?
Sure, there's a number of helpful proposals in the legislation, but raising the threshold that a shareholder has to meet. Certainly Mr. Landers has skin in the game, but not all of them do. Eliminating or raising the resubmission thresholds. And really, there's also a problem with just serial proponents. There are shareholder proponents that will drop a proposal at a company every year. It may not be the same proposal, but they're just after some other game.
And I thank you, and I'm sure there's others, and I'd like you to submit them for the record. I'm proud to have my legislation, the Corporate Governance Examination Act, included as one of the bills the committee is considering in this hearing today. It requires the SEC to conduct a study at least every 5 years on the shareholder proposal and proxy processes. And this is then going to make sure that the process doesn't become unnecessarily politicized, and will help to inform both Congress and the SEC on changes that might be needed to ensure that we put investors first. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donald, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. It's good to be here. It was said earlier in this committee, actually a couple of things, that a lot of members were activists in their way to be coming to Capitol Hill. I was an activist locally in my community before I came to Capitol Hill. The thing we always advocated for was free markets, the United States Constitution, and we didn't want to have outside groups wielding this nefarious power to try to shift the very fabric of our capitalist system underneath our noses. And it looks like what these proxy advisory firms have been doing is that very thing. They've been using our system of free information as a way to shift the very nature of free market, competitive economics, and actually substitute that with nefarious countercultural, socialistic policies that are not in the best interest of the United States. ESG policy is very indicative of that fact. And so this is a hearing that, in my view, is long overdue. Mr. Copland, can you elaborate on how activists have hijacked the proxy proposal process to push left-wing ideology through corporations?
Yes, a very small percentage of shareholders are introducing virtually all of these shareholder proposals. They're corporate gadflies. There's a guy, John Chevedden, who this year gave himself proposed 1/3 of all shareholder proposals. Then you've got social investing funds with an express purpose that's different from just maximizing share value that introduce a lot of these proposals. And the other block are really labor-affiliated funds. They could be private labor unions like the contractors union. They could be public pension funds for public employees, such as the New York City funds that Comptroller Lander works on. And that's really who supports all these proposals. None of the other institutional investors that are simply focused on the markets do that. Now, some of them vote for them, in part because the proxy advisors are directing them to, telling them to, and they defer to those proxy advisors, or in part because they're passive index funds and they've been captured. They've gotten a little better in the last year, but they've historically gone for this. But they don't really have skin in the game in any of these companies because they're just mirroring the stock market.
No, I agree with you, and I found like some of those funds, social impact funds, the performance is actually worse than funds that are actually looking for value, which is a detriment to the shareholders across the board. Mrs. Keel, do proxy advisory firms have fiduciary duties to the companies or shareholders that they are advising?
They do not have any fiduciary duties to the companies that they are advising, and they're imposing these standards on and kind of an implicit threat to follow their regulations. Some of them, ISS does have a fiduciary duty to its clients because it's regulated under the Investment Advisor Act, but Glass Lewis is not. So I think that's an important distinction because they do the exact same thing, and so it's a query in my mind as to why one of them is regulated, and I should also mention that it's a very, very light touch regulation, but it doesn't really make any sense that one would be regulated and one is not.
Okay. This hearing got really interesting a little bit ago with my colleague from New Jersey. So, Mr. Lander, I have to come to you. You're the Comptroller of the City of New York. You talked about the proposal by Mr. Mamdani for government-run grocery stores. Do you think that's a viable proposal for the people of the City of New York?
All around the country, there are quite a few places where there are publicly owned grocery stores designed to offer healthy, nutritious, affordable food in food deserts where people have no other options. That is
Mr.
working
Lander,
in red and blue states around the country.
Mr. Lander, you do realize that these grocery stores have less product available. The food is not nearly as good. Some of them shut down. The standards in them are, quite frankly, disgusting. Do you think it's in the interest of the people of New York to open this up? And by the way, I'm from Brooklyn, New York, so I've grown up in the city.
I'm so glad to hear it. But if you grew up in low-income neighborhoods in Brooklyn,
Sir, I
you would
grew
see
up
that
in
you
Crown Heights,
had.
Brooklyn, a low-income neighborhood.
Then you would have seen
The
that
city
many of the
city of New
privately
York-
owned
the city of
stores
New York-
nearby
the
had
city of New
low
York
quality
got
and high
out
prices.
of the business of distributing food when I was a kid. The city of New York used to distribute food. They got out of that business. They did when I was a kid. You
We
think it's
still
okay to
provide a
go back?
whole lot of free meals in our summer camp programs, in our after-school programs, and in our schools that an enormous number of low-income and working-class families rely on. That is government-distributed food. Should we cut it off?
Last question for you. Can you condemn the phrase global intifada.
I made real clear, if you mean I don't think people should say
So you
it,
won't
I
condemn
condemn
it.
it. If you want to
So
make
you
it
won't
against the
condemn the
law
phrase.
and send people
You
to
won't
jail
condemn
for
the
saying
phrase.
it,
Gentleman's time
I
has
don't.
expired.
This is why the city of New York is going down the toilet. I yield.
it's doing great. Thank
The
you. You should come
gentleman's
back and
time has
visit.
expired. Thank you. Now, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, who chairs our Digital Assets, Financial Technology, and AI Subcommittee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Hill, and thank you for holding today's hearing. This is a really important topic that we need to discuss, but it tells you a lot about the state of the Democratic Party, where their witness has to come and defend government-run grocery stores. It tells you a lot about the state of the Democratic Party. But let's dive into proxy advisors, because I think that is one of the biggest unknown challenges that we face. The proxy advisor duopoly, run by foreign-owned operations, as highlighted by Mr. Copland, that is not properly regulated, as highlighted by Ms. Keel, sets us up for an opportunity to stop the abuse that's been occurring in Americans' retirement accounts, their 401ks, and their pension plans, which have been weaponized to deliver a political agenda rather than to prepare them successfully for retirement. I, in particular, want to talk about potential conflicts of interest, and whether or not that conflict exists inside ISS and Glass Lewis, who are providing two key services at the same time and claiming that there's not a conflict. On one side of the ledger, they're advising asset managers about the underlying shareholder proposal votes. Is that correct, Mr. Copland?
Yes.
And on the other side, are they also providing advice and consent to the companies that they're advising upon?
Yes.
So they're being paid on one side by asset managers to review proposals that will directly impact management, and on the other side, they're being paid by management to provide consulting services. Is that right?
Yes.
That seems like a conflict of interest, right?
It does to me.
And so one of the best ways that we address conflicts of interest is we disclose information to the public. Sunlight is often the best disinfectant. And so it would be rational to me that the Securities and Exchange Commission would come in and force ISS and Glass Lewis to disclose any conflicts of interest when they're on both sides of the ledger. Do you agree that that's a reasonable proposal, Mr. Copland?
It's reasonable to me.
And does the Securities and Exchange Commission require this type of disclosure?
It doesn't. There were efforts made. So in 2020,
Yeah, there were efforts made, right? And you come in and we have a proposal that then is struck down by Chairman Gensler. But you could come in under this Securities and Exchange Commission, and Atkins and the team at the SEC could come in and force those disclosures be by ISS and Glass Lewis ultimately, right?
It's been litigated in court, and courts are coming out in slightly different ways. I mean, I think it's why this body ought to act, probably, because you ought to make clear that proxy advisors, I think you've got a bill in here that would have them be registered, right, with the SEC.
My bill does exactly that. And so, Ms. Keel, your comment that only ISS has some basic level of regulation on them, Glass Lewis is pretty much outside the structure. You would encourage the Congress to pass legislation that puts both of them under a regulatory environment in the Securities and Exchange Commission, right?
Absolutely. I think that would be welcome to have regulation at the federal level.
And Mr. Mueller, you would agree?
Yes.
What do you think the risk is, Mr. Mueller, to folks that are saving for retirement, people that have funds that are ultimately being voted on by these large asset managers as they prepare for retirement, could be in a 401k, could be part of a pension plan, that the underlying vote on shareholder proposals is being driven by two proxy advisors, one ISS and both Glass Lewis, which are owned by entities outside the United States. What does that say to Americans saving for retirement?
Well, the concern is whether Americans can trust that their votes are being used productively, or whether they're being used to help enrich these two firms with their advisory services.
And have we seen instances of that? Have you seen, for example, oil companies being told to stop producing fossil fuels, or have you seen an insurance company being told to price insurance based on race, which is obviously illegal? Have we seen these types of recommendations by this duopoly?
We've seen them supporting shareholder proposals that asked to interfere with the company's business, yes.
So not in the best interest of Americans who are trying to prepare and save for retirement. Instead, we've seen it hijacked by a duopoly, foreign-owned entities, not disclosing conflicts of interest. This seems incredibly problematic. We have an opportunity to act here. I've had legislation that I've introduced time and time again. It's time that we move this all the way across the line. The Securities and Exchange Commission comes in, ends this duopoly, and finally stands up for the American people who are working their tails off to save for retirement so that their retirement funds are not being hijacked to deliver the political agenda of these proxy advisors. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, the chair of the House's Homeland Security Committee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for being here today. Urgent reform is necessary for the shareholder proposal process. What once was a mechanism for democratizing shareholder oversight has been increasingly utilized by activist shareholders to push niche policy objectives that do not align with maximizing shareholder value. This untethered activism diverts significant resources and management attention from fundamental business matters, thereby undermining market efficiency and discouraging firms from becoming publicly traded. Mr. Copland, do companies feel that they have to hold votes on certain proposals for fear of public scrutiny?
Yes, under the current rules.
So what are some of the ramifications that they're afraid of?
Well, things can be misportrayed in the press. The proxy advisory firms can treat these advisory or precatory proposals as effectively binding and vote against their directors. If the company doesn't act, if the board doesn't say, with our fiduciary duty, we disagree, they could be asked to violate that, or we're going to vote no on your directors next time as a proxy advisor. And they'll do that. Glass Lewis expressly does it when 70% of the shareholders vote no on the proposal. I mean, that's insane.
It's definitely insane. Goes after what these directors are supposed to be doing, what the company's supposed to be doing for their shareholders. Under former SEC Chair Gensler, thank God he's gone, changes to proxy rules made it easier for special interest groups to include politically motivated shareholder proposals in annual statements, reversing prior reforms. From 2020 to 2024, the total number of proposals grew, with environmental and social proposals on topics such as climate change, DEI, human rights, and lobbying, seeing a 59% increase and becoming a dominant part of the shareholder landscape. Mr. Copland, this is an obvious answer, I think, but is the shareholder proposal process being abused by these special interest groups?
Yes.
Yes. So I want you to go on record and talk about some of the examples that have for this abuse.
Yes, I mean, and I've pointed to these for years where, a shareholder will buy a small amount of shares, for instance, an animal rights group like PETA in Levi's, and talk about like leather patches on the jeans and get on the agenda with small amounts of shares on this.
When you say small, what do you mean?
A few $1,000s,
Yeah.
which would be enough to get over the threshold. I mean, if the thresholds go up, they'll get a little more. We actually found, we commissioned a study when Comptroller Lander's predecessor, Scott Stringer, launched his boardroom accountability project, and really, I mean, as Representative Velasquez said, the New York City pension funds have been playing politics for years with corporate proxies, but he really ratcheted up to another level. So we commissioned a study by Tracy Weidke at University of Tennessee and found not only a negative association in terms of share value with the environmental and social activism that public pension funds were engaging in, but we found they typically invested less relative to other companies in the companies they were engaging with. So they weren't really putting their money where their mouth was. They were buying enough stock in these companies, but not as much. So we've seen individual shareholders make a living out of this. I mean, the late Evelyn Davis was one of the early corporate gadflies. She used to make $600,000 a year selling a 12-page booklet to corporate CEOs, and you had to buy two, and she charged like $650 per booklet, basically because they wanted to stay in her good graces. They didn't want her to target them. I mean, it's rife with abuse.
Absolutely, and what's even worse is I think a lot of these proposals, less than 30% of participation vote totals indicates that this is out of step with most shareholders. Switching gears a little, investment advisors rely on proxy advising firms to help meet their fiduciary duty by providing research, voting guidelines, and support for thousands of votes each year. While we can all acknowledge a need for reform, we must also take into account the costs that come with the legislations for advisors of all sizes. How can Congress, Mr. Copland, and regulators ensure reforms to preserve the independence and availability of these services without adding costs or barriers that impair advisors' abilities to vote for their clients?
Well, I think the colloquy we had with Representative Style a minute ago was instructive. I mean, I think they should be registered. I think they should have oversight. I think there should be disclosure. I think there should be disclosure on the institutional investor side if they're utilizing the services, certainly if they're robo-voting the services, if they're just deferring to the proxy advisor. All of these things could help.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd first like to ask unanimous consent to submit a letter titled Proxy Power and Proposal Abuse to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here, and Mrs. Ferrell, Keel, thank you. Trying not to be redundant, but I wanted to go back to something and say it kind of just in black and white, and that is ISS and Glass Lewis leverage their control of the proxy advisory market to encourage U.S. companies to purchase their consulting services. That's happening. Creating that appearance and doing so, it may help to avoid the negative voting recommendations, but Mr. Mueller, in your experience working with public companies, what risks do you see when proxy advisory firms issue voting recommendations while also selling consulting and advocacy services?
I'll address three real quickly. I mean, first, it encourages the firms to have a lack of transparency so that you have to buy their services to know how they're going to recommend on something. And it also encourages kind of a check-the-box approach by the proxy advisory firms, because they do maintain an ethical wall, but if both sides of that wall have the same checklist, then that wall doesn't matter. There's still a conflict of interest. And then, of course, shareholders and companies are the ones that are suffering from the votes. The customers of ISS, as we've heard, may not have the economic incentive to exercise a lot of scrutiny on those voting recommendations, but they're not the ones that are hurt. It's the shareholders at large and the companies that suffer from the voting recommendations.
So in your estimation, is there any way for this to be kind of shifted or changed in a way that would eliminate the conflict? Or is the only way to really get rid of this the way we're addressing this with legislation, which is to simply sever the ability to do that, to get rid of the conflict?
There should certainly be regulation, because right now the SEC has its arms tied behind its back on this. And yes, they should certainly evaluate. I mean, certainly, for example, audit firms are not allowed to both audit a client and give certain consulting services to those clients. It's just an irreconcilable conflict and is prohibited, and that may be the solution here.
Mr. Copland, turning to you, based on your research and analysis of the shareholder proposal process, can you discuss how recurring or the duplicative proposals affect the efficiency and the clarity of the proxy materials that people are receiving very, very often and in a way that sometimes is nonchalant? It's simply mailed to them, and they're overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's can be hard to figure out. I mean, if you've got two proposals on similar subject matter, are you going to really tease those apart well? And then what if shareholders vote yes on one and no on another, and it's sort of ambiguous or there's conflicts? The recurring issue, because the resubmission thresholds have traditionally been so low, proponents can get these on the ballot year after year after year after year, and the proxy advisors take the odd position that if it fails year after year after year after year, and then one year it gets a majority, they've got to act on that, or we may vote against your directors, even though it could potentially flip back the next year. So it's kind of a mess. I didn't put much in this testimony about it, but I put a lot more in my 2016 testimony and in comment letters to the SEC in 2020 and 2022 on this issue, and they're all referenced in my written testimony.
Yeah, so do you currently believe the thresholds for resubmitting the failed proposals, which is kind of a whole other area, you didn't get the outcome you wanted, so you simply bring it back again, maybe with different verbiage, right?
Could be different verbiage, could be the same verbiage. If it hits above those relatively modest thresholds, they can keep doing it year after year. So if you get a proxy advisory firm that likes it, it's going to stay on the ballot in perpetuity, effectively, even if people continue, even if the vast majority of shareholders vote against it year after year.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Nebraska, the chair of our Housing and Insurance Subcommittee, Mr. Flood, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we've talked about today, we have an increasingly alarming problem as it relates to shareholder proposals in this country. 62%, that's the number I want you to remember. In 2024, environmental and social proposals made up 62% of total shareholder proposals, according to a report from ISS Corporate. Think about that. More than 60% of shareholder proposals last year were related to environmental and social topics. That's a really staggering total, and it's one that should alarm everybody on this committee. We have activists treating public companies as their own personal forum for social and environmental change, and quite frankly, it's a waste of time, and it's a waste of money, and it's ultimately sucking productivity out of our economy and into organizations that seek to perpetuate endless social and cultural war in corporate America. Something that I don't think proponents of progressive social and environmental shareholder proposals fully understand is that with the door open to political shareholder proposals, we're now seeing politically motivated shareholder proposals coming from now both directions. According to a Financial Times article from last week, U.S. shareholders did not pass a single environmental shareholder proposal in 2025. On the other hand, anti-ESG proposals are increasing in frequency. According to a recent study, anti-ESG proposals increased, get this, 67% from 23 to 24 in the 500 largest U.S. public companies by revenue. So if we don't act, I fear we're seeing the beginning of what's likely to become a pattern. In years when the cultural momentum is moving to the left, we have a surge of environmental and social proposals. And in years when we have a cultural movement to the right, we're going to see more anti-ESG shareholder proposals. The end result is that we never actually address the underlying issue of activist shareholder proposals. Instead, these investors will use our public companies as a political football, and we will see them whipsaw from one set of cultural objectives to another. Mrs. Keel, in your testimony, you highlighted one example of a shareholder proposal that would have asked a store that sells hammers and nails to make a public statement on abortion. Let's use that particular proposal as an example. What kinds of costs would the company incur on a single proposal like that in terms of money, employee time, and legal fees?
Sure. So when you think about how a company would analyze that coming in, they would have to think about their internal policies, procedures, how they're currently addressing these issues of healthcare with their own employees, what sort of information would they have to disclose with what this report is requesting of them. But I think the bigger point maybe is the intangible kind of cost, right, of taking a stance on something that is so polarizing and personal. And so they're being asked to come out and take a stance on something that employees, customers, suppliers, everyone's going to have a different view, and it really has nothing to do with the business. And so query why they're having to address it in their proxy statement.
I appreciate that. Think about a steel worker in my hometown. Believe it or not, we make steel in the middle of the prairie in Norfolk, Nebraska. Their retirement is underpinned by mutual funds, investments in public companies. They go to work every day and they watch that balance, and they want to know that if America's booming, so are they. But instead, some activist shareholder gets in there and starts messing with that steel worker's future and their balance. And I think you make a very good point there. I think it's important to highlight these are frivolous proposals that are not victimless, and they aren't costless. These activists are using our capital markets to play these games. I'd like to speak briefly on the proxy advisor firms and their extreme power in this story. In an article recently published by the Financial Times, I was struck by a quote about the proxy advisor firm ISS. Mark Lindsay of Jasper Street, which is a firm that advises public companies or shareholder proposals, said the following when asked why 0 environmental shareholder proposals passed this year. He said, quote, "Every environmental proposal that has passed had ISS as a supporter, and this year, no proposals have ISS as a supporter." Mr. Copland, can you speak to the weight of an ISS recommendation in the result of shareholder proposals?
Studies vary on it. We did one in 2012, and what we found using the data set we were looking at was that an ISS recommendation was about a 15 percentage point bump in favor of a shareholder proposal. I've seen higher estimates, I've seen lower estimates. It probably depends a lot on company size in terms of how much delegation to ISS there'd be on the part of the institutional investors.
I appreciate that, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Stutzman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The shareholder proposal process we're discussing today was originally designed to give investors a voice in the companies they are shareholders of. But today, the process has been hijacked. A small group of activists will buy just enough shares to qualify under the law, then flood companies with radical social and political proposals that have nothing to do with profits, jobs, or innovation. Instead, they force businesses into costly and divisive debates on things like climate change, DEI, abortion, and gender ideology. And it's not just companies on Wall Street in the crosshairs. It's businesses across the country, including those in Indiana, that are targets as well. Cummins, headquartered in Columbus, Indiana, was the target of a resolution demanding that it tie its executive pay to unrealistic climate targets that would destroy its business. Eli Lilly, another Indiana-based company activist, demanded that it divert critical resources towards a report on DEI hiring quotas instead of focusing on its core mission of developing life-saving medications. These activists are not hiding the ball either. Groups like As You Sow flaunt their proposals on their website, and I encourage those watching at home to look for themselves and see how extreme these proposals truly are. Here's one for Amazon, in which activists successfully pressured the company into hiring an expensive law firm to conduct a full-fledged racial equality audit. In fact, over 30 American companies, ranging from Uber to Chipotle, have been pressured into similar audits. Here's another for Coca-Cola that demanded they study how to increase abortion access for their employees. Here's a similar proposal for McDonald's that asked the company to explore gender-affirming care for employees' children. Since the barriers to entry are so low, all it takes is a few $1,000s for these activists to propose these radical ideas and have them included for a vote. Thank you all for being here today. Ms. Keel, I know you spent a lot of time working with companies that receive these type of proposals. How difficult is it for companies to combat these proposals, and what are the costs for those that choose to do so?
Sure. So there are a few different ways you can go about it, and I think one important word to focus on is combat, right? I don't think it necessarily, it would be ideal, right, if we weren't thinking of it in that direction, and instead we were able to think of it as, are we deciding what's material to our investors and what we're going to put on our proxy statement? Are we exercising a legal right by going to court and trying to understand the application of these rules? I would not consider those combative. I would understand those, explain those as exercising one's legal rights. But yeah, it's inordinately expensive, both in terms of legal fees, but then also in terms of making the headlines, right? And navigating the discussions with your shareholders and customers and suppliers. That's very taxing on companies.
Are you seeing a lot of activity in relation to this sort of action, and investors that are pushing companies have just calmed down a little bit, or are we still seeing quite a bit of activity?
It's heightened more than ever, and I think we see that because we see both left and right activists, right? And to Mr. Copland's point, you know, we'll see that on the same proxy statement, a pro-DEI proposal and an anti-DEI one, and a company can be a bit stuck in the middle, if you will, on how to address that.
Yeah, Mr. Copland, I've got a question for you. Something we've heard about today is the need for more transparency from proxy advisory firms and there's little doubt about the influence these firms have over the outcomes of proxy voting and their lack of transparency, and it's certainly cause for concern. Just two proxy advisor firms, ISS and Glass Lewis, control 90% of the market, yet lack any sort of meaningful oversight. As a result, we have little information about the independence of their recommendations or potential bias. Do these proxy firms tend to favor certain types of proposals? And also, specifically, do they give more support to left-leaning ESG and DEI proposals than do proposals that might reflect conservative concerns?
Historically, yes, right? I mean, as has been mentioned, there was sort of a pullback this year from ISS on some of its recommendations, but historically, we've seen upwards of 70%, upwards of 50%, upwards of 30% of various sort of left-leaning ENS-inflected proposals, and essentially never support for more free market or conservative proposals on the other side.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing today. I've seen this, up close and personal in some of the companies in my private activity before, and it can cause real problems. So thank you for bringing awareness to this, and I appreciate the witness's testimony as well. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lander, the New York State Comptroller, Tom DiNapoli, just put out a report that $1.2 billion in taxpayer money was spent paying for health care premiums for Medicaid recipients who no longer live in New York State. Have you seen that report?
I have not reviewed that report.
Are you going to review that report?
I am absolutely going to review that report. We cannot afford to be, and I assume you're representing it accurately, doing anything like that.
This is Tom DiNapoli's own
I believe
report.
you. I just haven't had the chance to
Okay, so you will be evaluating the impact on New York City?
Absolutely.
Okay. Do you support the use of taxpayer money that has been used over the last few years in New York to provide health care for illegal immigrants?
The short answer is yes. Where folks are undocumented, but they are working in New York City, it is so much better for them to have access to primary health care than it is for them to wind up in emergency rooms in ways that bear much greater costs.
So you just distinguish if they're working. If they're not working, do you support the use of taxpayer money to provide free health care for illegal immigrants that are not working?
I mean, the primary care approach is what we generally try to use through our federally qualified health centers. If someone is brought to an emergency room, do I think that their life should be saved rather than worrying about their immigration status or how they can pay for their health care? I do think so, yes.
That is the law, and hospitals do provide that care. But specifically in New York, billions of dollars of taxpayer money has been used to provide free housing, clothing, food, education, and health care to illegal immigrants, regardless of whether or not they are working or not. And we have seen, obviously, in New York City in particular, the city of which you are the comptroller, billions of dollars of taxpayer money being used. Do you support the use of those funds to provide free health care to illegal immigrants? That's what I'm asking. It's yes or no.
And I answered yes. Billions of dollars being generated by folks who are undocumented in taxes and revenue for New York City and New York State as well.
There's no question that immigrants contribute greatly to our economy. The issue here has been, as you well know, in New York, okay, hundreds of thousands of migrants coming into the city. The city has crippled under the weight of that cost, okay? Those are the words of the mayor. Those are the words of elected officials.
I have financial oversight, I can tell you.
Those are the words of the elected officials in New York City, that New York City voters duly elected. Now, you called yourself in 2016 a Brooklyn Jewish Democratic Socialist. And so my question to you is...
in that article, just to be clear.
My question to you is, what is your relationship with the Working Families Party of New York and the Democratic Socialists of America, New York City chapter?
Of the Working Families Party, I am a member and a donor. Of the Democratic Socialists of America, I am not a member or a donor.
Do you support the DSA of New York City?
I'm not a member or a donor to the DSA of New York City.
There is a lot of overlap between the DSA of New York City and the WFP of New York. Do you support the work of the DSA of New York City?
There are things they have proposed that I have supported, like raising the minimum wage, and there are things they have proposed that I do not support, like BDS.
Okay. So with respect to BDS, and I'm glad you brought that up, the DSA of New York City just adopted a resolution as part of this national convention. They want to expel members who do not comply with their extremist views, and specifically, anyone who supports Israel's right to defend themselves. Do you oppose that position in their platform?
Yes.
Okay. Zohran Mamdani, who you support for mayor, is fully endorsed and embraced by the DSA of New York City, and in fact, just the other day said that Israeli bond investments violate New York City values. Do you agree with your endorsed candidate for mayor that Israeli bond investments violate New York City values?
So I am the fiduciary for New York City's investments, and I make those decisions based on that fiduciary obligation. First, I'll broadly say I don't support BDS, as I said. New York City's pension funds under my watch have over $300 million invested in Israeli companies. We do not have Israeli bonds because we do not broadly have foreign bonds in other countries in Canada or England or France.
Do you think Israeli bond investments violate New York City values? Do you agree with Zohran Mamdani?
My job as controller is not to assess alignment
It's a pretty
with
straightforward
No, this is
question
actually
that you as
important.
controller should
I
be able
have
to
a
answer.
fiduciary duty to figure out best risk-adjusted
Gentleman's
return.
time is
Okay, so you slightly support.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I did not
Mr.
think that the Israeli bonds that were
Mr.
held
Lander,
in the...
the time has expired, I'm sorry. You can continue this in writing at the request of Congressman Lawler or after the meeting in the hallway. We now recognize the gentleman from Montana. Mr. Downing, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses here. You know, as a former Commissioner of Securities, I had, certain interactions with the former administration of the SEC, Gary Gensler. And when he would bring things down, such as, rule promulgation, non-mandatory climate disclosures, and some other things, I would reach out to him and say, my job as the Commissioner of Securities is to protect investors. Your job is to protect investors. Let's both stay in our lanes here. And that was a common refrain there. And another short story is I was also the Commissioner of Insurance. And I had a meeting with a reinsurance group, who I won't name here, talking about the risk that they were pulling out of. They were pulling out of oil and gas. They were pulling out of, they said, animal rights issues and some other things. And that kind of raised my interest. And I said, hey, I come from a state where we have more cows than people, and we plan on eating them. Is that going to be a problem? And their response was, we're not sure. And so fast forward a little bit, I had, under the condition of confidentiality, a reinsurance group come up to me telling me about their shareholders, their proxy votes. And they said, we're being pressured to take these positions on ESG issues that we do not believe are in the interest of our business. And that really caught my attention. So all of this stuff that I'm dealing with as a Commissioner of Securities and Insurance is coming from something that has another goal. And my theory there was that, folks that didn't like certain industries, that didn't like oil and gas, didn't like agriculture, whatever it is they didn't like, couldn't shut it down from the front door, so they were trying to come from the back door and make sure you didn't have access to capital markets and make sure you didn't have access to insurance. And so I'm going to start here on proxy advisors. Thank you for bearing with me on that. Today we have a duopoly with ISS and Glass Lewis, making up 97% of the proxy advisory market. And often it seems like these firms care more about pushing a social and environmental agenda on public companies than doing what is best for their shareholders. In fact, proxy advisor firms have no legal obligation to act in the best interest of their shareholders despite having enormous sway. I'm going to start with Mr. Copland. How does this lack of a fiduciary duty for proxy advisory firms impact the quality and the objectivity of their recommendations?
Well, it has to. There's really no check on them. They can say, to some degree, whatever they want. There's going to be anti-fraud repercussions they could face, et cetera. But it's not a clear fiduciary situation, right? I mean, they're contracted with other fiduciaries.
Right.
But it's tricky, but it certainly affects the quality.
Yeah, it really is a shame that the previous administration focused on the needs of activists rather than the needs of everyday investors. And the SEC, under the previous leadership, essentially encouraged activists to force companies to consider and adopt policy changes that Joe Biden and the Democrats could not get through Congress. Thankfully, SEC Chair Paul Atkins has already rescinded some of these decisions that permitted the worst abuses of the shareholder proposal process. I'm going to move on to Mrs. Keel. In June, the D.C. District Court upheld the SEC's 2020 amendments to Rule 14a-8, which set eligibility requirements for submitting shareholder proposals and proxy statements. The court found that the SEC acted appropriately in updating the rules to increase ownership thresholds and support levels required for proposal resubmission. Do you think the SEC should consider raising the current submission and resubmission thresholds further?
I definitely do. From an ownership standpoint, I think it's important in a lot of areas of securities, we really try to align the people with influence with an economic interest and skin in the game. So we do that for directors, we do that for the kind of real activists, not the activists that we're talking about today. We do that for employees and executive officers. But here, we don't really have any economic alignment there to kind of safeguard against somebody, exploiting it with their own interests. On the resubmission thresholds, definitely, I think that when we ignore the majority of a shareholder's vote on something, it's really ignoring their voice. And so if we're talking about shareholder democracy, we really should respect what they have to say.
Right, thank you. And shifting gears a little bit, there's obviously costs in terms of time, resources, legal fees, and responding to engaging with shareholder proposals. Do you have any thoughts on whether these costs increased during the Biden administration and roughly by how much?
I don't have a dollar amount, but I would say that the cost is indirect, really, because it's been the pressure on the companies to adopt these disclosure standards. And one statistic I found is that it would take about $500,000 to do a kind of sustainability report each year.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from South Texas, Ms. Dela Cruz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. As a South Texas member of Congress, I come from a district where we are hardworking, blue-collar, entrepreneurial, and really business-driven. Most people I know walking into my local grocery store and familiar faces. I can tell you that the money that they earn and that they invest, they want to know that that money is growing for their future, for their family's future, and not to promote a political agenda. So I'm grateful for you all to be here today to discuss this important issue, because there are some activists that are using this system to advance their agendas rather than maximize shareholder value for our constituents. That being said, Ms. Keel, I think for some people back home, it's hard to understand what the Rule 14a-8 really is and just the basics of it, how it impacts. So if you were talking to my person in rural Texas, could you give us some basic information about this rule and how it greatly impacts their life in George West, Texas?
Sure. So the rule basically came into effect in the 1940s. And the purpose of it was to bring matters of concern to their fellow stockholders. So it's meant to have stockholders have access, to management. But over the years, what we've seen is that it's not really bringing matters of concern to their fellow stockholders. It's bringing matters that are concerning to them and, very narrowly just them. So right now, we'll see lots of shareholder activists from both the left and the right will submit proposals relating to all sorts of issues. Some are governance, some are compensation, and then we have a lot of proposals on what we call the E and the S, so the environmental and the social. And those are going to be addressing highly politicized topics that reasonable minds can certainly disagree on. And so once they submit those to a company will be obligated to consider that and put it on its proxy statement unless it decides to exclude it. And then there's an entire process for going through that process.
So you mentioned that these are activists from the far right and the far left, that there is an issue here that we need to address, and that issue needs to be rational guardrails to put in place. So this should really not even be a partisan issue. This should be a common sense issue. What guardrails could you share with my constituents listening today that would be very effective?
Sure. The simplest one is really a threshold of ownership, right? To ensure that there's some sort of alignment, that somebody is not just buying $2,000 worth of stock, which is not to say that that's not a lot of money, but to be able to influence the policy of a Fortune 500 company for that amount there's a big gulf there. So I think that that's what would be the most important thing, is that they, as shareholders in the pension funds, the 401ks that they've worked so hard with, they want people to be bringing proposals of value to the stockholders, that they can consider interesting ideas, not ideological agendas that are narrowly, sometimes tenuously would be maybe a generous word, connected to a company.
So what I hear is ownership is vital to having a voice and putting your opinion into the agenda and into the future proposals. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, thank you. I thought that your written testimony, especially your explanation on the company intake and response process to shareholder proposals, was helpful in showing just how costly and time-consuming they can be. Can you please briefly walk us through this response process?
Sure. When someone gets a proposal, first they're going to say if they've ever actually already addressed it. In many instances, they will have already considered it. But if not, they're going to really have to think, a company will have to think about how it could impact the company. A lot of potential harms here: legal privilege, disclosing confidential information, disclosing strategies, disclosing sensitive information for employees. Sometimes it won't even be legal, right? So they have to analyze that. And then they have to analyze whether it would harm the business or whether there would be a cost benefit, having to understand what that connection is and whether it merits the investment.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. I want to thank our panel for their testimony today, for the great interaction with all of our members on both sides of the aisle. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions to the witnesses to the chair. The questions will be forwarded to the witnesses for your response. Witnesses, we invite you to respond no later than October 15th of 2025. This hearing is adjourned.